The November wind in Billings had a sharp, dry bite. It carried the smell of scorched earth and that faint tang of cow manure that just hung in the air. The auction yard sat alone in a bare, forgotten field. The grass was long gone, trampled to the roots, replaced by dust thick enough to swallow your boots whole. People packed themselves around old wooden benches, gnawing on jerky, spitting at their feet, laughing way too loud. A broken-down loudspeaker crackled like it had asthma, barking out bids over the noise. Metal bars clanged against rusted gates. Cattle bawled as they were dragged away, their cries mixing with raspy voices yelling over one another. "Who's got 500? 500? Let's go!" It was just another morning here. Rough, dry, and absolutely heartless. This wasn't a place for feeling. It was a place for numbers. What animal could still breed? Which one had enough muscle to pull a cart? And which one wasn't worth a penny? They didn't come here to care. They came to buy and walk away. Then Star walked out. The gate creaked open, and from a patch of shadow he limped into the light. Thin legs carried a body that looked like it had barely survived something awful. His fur was clumped and dirty, dull like ash. One back leg dragged behind with almost no strength left. Around his neck was a scar, a brutal ring, as if a red-hot chain had once been fused into his skin. His chest was sunken in, ribs poking through like tree roots in dry soil. Star didn't bark, didn't whimper, didn't growl. He just stood there, still, straight ahead. Like this whole awful scene was something he'd already lived through 100 times before. The crowd started whispering. "That thing still breathing? Put it down already. Probably got something nasty." But Star didn't move, didn't flinch. Just a tiny tremble in his legs under the weight of so many cold eyes. A beam of sunlight broke through a crack in the tin roof and hit the dusty floor, landing square on Star's face. And in that spotlight, he stood right on the edge between being alive and being forgotten. No begging, no pleading for pity. Just the way he held himself, fighting the shiver, made the whole place go quiet for just a second. At the back, leaning on a wooden railing, stood a man in a beat-up leather jacket. Hair silvering, falling into his eyes. A faint scar ran down from his jaw to his neck. His name was Jonas Whitaker. No one knew him. No one noticed how long he'd been there. Jonas didn't laugh, didn't move, just watched, and Star watched him back. That amber gaze, silent and steady, locked onto Jonas. Not desperate, not afraid, just ancient, like a memory long buried but never erased. The auctioneer's voice dragged on, more bored than before. "No one? No one wants this one? $30? 20? Then Jonas raised his hand. No words, no bidding war, just his hand in the air, slow, certain, like he'd been waiting for this moment for years. People stirred, someone scoffed. "Who's the nut job, gonna bury it or boil it?" The gavel dropped. "Sold." The sound hit Jonas like thunder from a storm long past. A memory stirred bright metal, a box barely cracked open, and winter fog. A noise in the dark. He remembered. Back then, he used to drive for a shady company that moved dogs marked for behavioral testing. No questions, no names, just crates in the back of his truck. One bitter winter, snow. Thick on the mountain roads, Jonas was driving a run-of-the-mill delivery when he heard its soft scratching. A low, broken whine, like a ghost tapping from the other side of the wall. He pulled over. Snow crunched under his boots as he walked to the back. There it was, a rusted, sealed metal crate, smeared with filth and dried blood. No label, nothing to say what was inside. But when Jonas cracked it open just a few inches, those eyes stared out. Amber, blood-specked, terrified. Alert, but silent. Not a sound, That stare went straight through him, into places Jonas hadn't let anyone reach. He closed the door, didn't say a word, didn't do a thing, just turned and walked away. It was just one crate in hundreds, but it was the only one he never forgot. And now, here, in this dusty yard, those same eyes were staring at him again. Jonas stepped toward Star, slowly, carefully, like he was walking back to some broken part of himself he'd left behind years ago. Star didn't move. One ear twitched as Jonas crouched down to his level. He didn't reach, didn't stroke, just sat, eye to eye. "Hey." His voice barely broke the air, just a breath, like something exhaled from deep inside his chest. Star tilted his head, a small movement, but it carried so much. Jonas held his hand out, hovering just off Star's shoulder, not touching, just waiting. Then Star leaned in. Light, barely there. His shoulder brushed Jonas's hand without no fear, no hesitation. And they stayed like that. Someone in the crowd captured the moment on an old phone. The clip was blurry, full of static, but it showed one man sitting in a patch of dusty sunlight and one starving dog resting gently against a hand that never tried to take. That video didn't go viral. Not yet. But it would. Because in a place no one would remember, two souls that the world had given up on chose not to give up on each other. Jonas never knew why he raised his hand. But in that noisy, dusty yard, something inside him finally answered a call he'd ignored too long. This time he didn't turn away. The wind died down after the gavel fell. But the loudest thing Jonas heard was the rhythm of Star's heartbeat. Silent. Steady. Calling him home. Star was still standing there, still staring at Jonas. But this time his eyes weren't just full of pain. Something else had returned, like the morning sun melting frost. Maybe trust, or at least a flicker of hope. Jonas adjusted his collar not from cold, but because his heart was thudding in a way he hadn't felt in years. The auction yard faded. The whispers blurred. All that remained was Star and the choice not to let the past repeat. He walked away, and Star followed. No leash, no commands, just quiet steps under soft, slanted sunlight. Together they left the dust and the stares and the cruel laughter behind. Ahead was nothing but a long dirt road. Behind them, the ghosts they never named. But Jonas knew today something had started to heal. And Star, with nothing but that look in his eyes, had already forgiven him, even before Jonas knew he needed it. From a distance, a gust of wind kicked up the dust, brushing Jonas' coat and the rough fur on Star's back. Two shadows drifted away from the auction yard, toward where the sun hadn't yet set. A child watched them go, fingers curled around a camera. He whispered, "Mom, did he just save that dog?" His mother didn't speak, just nodded, eyes still, following the two fading figures. And somewhere online, a short clip went live with one simple caption. A moment no one expected, but no one would forget. Later, the old truck rumbled to life. The tires rolled slowly across the dirt. Star lay curled in the back seat, tucked beneath thick blankets. Jonas glanced into the mirror, and there Star was, looking back at him. Not scared, not uncertain, just still. For the first time in years, Jonas smiled. Not because he won, but because finally the old cabin sat deep in a mossy valley near Laurel, tucked between tall grass and thick pine woods where the trails gave way to silence. Its roof, slanted and sagging, was blanketed in moss and vines, looking more like a memory left behind than a home anyone still lived in. The walls, made of weathered timber, had long since cracked with age. The cold crept in through every seam, every grain soaked with winter's breath. Time hadn't healed anything here. It just layered on more stillness. Wind slipped through the cracks in the door, whistling long and low, like someone breathing through clenched teeth. The air inside was thick with the scent of old ash from the fireplace, rotting wood, and damp pine needles. The darkness didn't feel scary, just familiar, like an old blanket wrapped around a soul that had wandered too far. Jonas parked the truck beneath the biggest pine at the end of the dirt path. No sign, no directions. This was the place he used to run to after the nightmares, after nameless jobs and faceless clients. The cabin had never felt like home. It was more of a hiding place somewhere to forget. But today, Jonas wasn't bringing memories or grief. He was bringing something else, a life, a soul, a dog who had lost the one thing nobody talks about until it's gone: trust. Star jumped out of the truck without a sound. No bark, no whine, no curious glance around. His limping paws touched the mossy ground like he was stepping into a place that once hurt him. Jonas opened the cabin door. A shaft of light from the late afternoon sun cut through the dusty air, casting long lines across the pale wooden floor. Star didn't sniff around like other dogs might. He walked straight in, like he'd been here before. He padded to a corner near the fireplace, circled once, and curled into a tight ball, eyes open, staring straight ahead. He didn't make a sound, just existed. Quiet and raw. Jonas placed a clean bowl of water and some soft smoked meat near Star's nose. Star didn't touch it. His eyes stayed wide open, but it was like he wasn't really seeing the room. Or Jonas. It was a look not of fear, but of searching, as if trying to piece together a memory long shattered. Those first few nights were filled with a silence that felt almost haunted. No barking, no scratching, not even a breath too loud. Just the ticking of the old wooden clock, dragging its weary beats like the final breaths of a forgotten past, and the crackle of firewood in the hearth. Jonas tried everything: warm milk, soft rice, blankets pulled near the flames. He even fed Star by hand, gently, spoon by spoon. But Star would pull back, quietly. No growling, no resistance, just refusal. He wouldn't accept anything that came from a human hand. Jonas didn't get angry, but deep inside, something stung. A kind of rejection he wasn't prepared for from a creature just as broken as he was. Each morning, Jonas would find Star sleeping in a different corner, always further away, always deeper into the shadows. Star didn't sleep much, but he never really closed his eyes either. They stayed half open, always watching, as if falling asleep meant waking up somewhere worse again. One night, Jonas was reading by the fire when he caught Star staring past him, at something behind. He turned to see the old metal coat hook by the door swaying in the wind, making a soft clinking sound. Star bolted into a corner, trembling hard, a low, choked whine stuck in his throat. It wasn't fear. It was something worse. It was relieving, not revival, not rebirth, but reliving pain. Chains, screams, darkness no one had ever tried to understand. The fire cast Star's shaking shadow against the wall. It stretched long and thin like the shape of a trauma that never really left. Jonas stood, walked over, unhooked the old metal piece, and tossed it into a wooden box in the corner. The room went quiet again. But it was a different quiet now. Not the kind that pushes you away. The kind that asks if maybe, just maybe, two haunted things can share the same space. One man, one dog, both with scars too deep for names, but clear enough to recognize in each other. Later that night, Jonas added another log to the fire. The glow warmed the room, flickering over the floor like sunlight on old wounds. Star was asleep, sort of his ears still twitching. And inside Jonas, something stirred. It started with a small sound. Not in the room, however, the memories were deeply ingrained within him. Memories he had buried started bubbling up, that long-ago winter drive. Tires sliding over snow, cold biting through every joint, a crate shifting in the back, a soft whimper swallowed by the howling wind. He hadn't checked it, didn't let himself care. All he'd done was deliver and drive. There was one time he'd opened the wrong crate by mistake. Just a sliver of light, and a pair of amber eyes met his. Wide, desperate, pleading. He'd slammed it shut, because it wasn't his job. That's what he told himself back then. Now he sat in the dark, one hand resting on a rusted chain. The other is bracing the armrest. Star slept near the fire, but his ears still twitched every time the wind sighed. Jonas stared into the flames and saw the truth. Those eyes from years ago, Star's eyes were the same. On the fourth night, Jonas woke suddenly. He hadn't heard anything, but he felt it. Warmth. He looked down. Star had moved closer. The star curled near his feet, back turned but not gone. Not trust, not yet. Just the comfort of human presence, close enough to rest. Jonas didn't move, didn't speak, didn't touch. He just whispered, "It wasn't your fault." "I know." Star didn't lift his head, but his tail tucked in just slightly, and for the first time, Star responded to something that wasn't a threat. It was small, but it was real. It was akin to a long-shut, rusted door, which shifts slightly when someone knocks, yet remains motionless without moving. And to Jonas, that tiny flick of a tail after hundreds of quiet nights of nothing felt like an answer. The next morning, Jonas stepped out onto the porch. Fog hung low. The wind carried the smell of moss, pine, and maybe, just maybe, a new beginning. The cabin hadn't changed, but everything else had. Because from that day on, the place he used to run from became the place he could finally return to. That morning, the forest of laurel was still half asleep beneath a blanket of thick mist. The trees whispered gently overhead, their leaves stirring like ancient curtains drawn across a long-forgotten memory. The silence was so complete that each step Jonas took over dry branches echoed like time snapping underfoot. The breeze carried the scent of damp earth, resinous pine, and something older, something unnamed, lingering between the past and now. Jonas didn't know why he turned off the path that day. The northern trail into the woods was a place he had always avoided. Not because it was dangerous, but because it held things he wasn't ready to face. Memories, helplessness, and that nameless fear that lived in all the things he'd left behind. But when he saw Star standing on the cabin porch, head tilted toward the tree line, as if listening for something deep in the woods, he understood. This was no longer a journey he'd take alone. They walked without a word. The shadows of man and dog stretched long across the damp forest floor, weaving through shafts of faint sunlight that pierced the canopy above. Every step Star took was grounded, deliberate, and every few dozen paces Star would pause, turn back, and glance at Jonas with just a flick of amber eyes, asking, "Still with me?" Jonas nodded, never needing to speak it out loud. He was starting to realize something. Star didn't need saving. Star needed someone willing to walk beside him. No commands, no pulling, no pushing, just presence. And somehow that was enough. The trail twisted and rose, lined with roots that jutted from the ground like hands reaching up from the soil. At times the wind picked up and spun leaves into the air, blanketing their path in rustling gold. But Star never slowed. His gray coat shimmered with dew, like a suit of silver armor, and his stride carried no trace of captivity. He moved like a soul who had already survived his storm. By the time they reached the creek where the water whispered over moss-covered stones, Jonas noticed it clearly. Star was leading, not charging ahead, but clearing the way with a freedom that had once been stolen. And without a word between them, Jonas felt his chest loosen, as if every step Star took was gently healing something inside him, carving through the invisible wounds that still ached in silence. A brittle branch cracked underfoot. Jonas froze. Star stopped too, ears alert, eyes turning back. For a few seconds they just looked at each other. Then they moved forward again. No signals, no words, just shared breath, shared rhythm. And in that stillness, Jonas knew. They weren't just walking. They were remembering. Together. From afar, the sun began to pierce through layers of thin cloud. A single beam of golden light broke through and touched the dew gathered on Star's fur. In that fleeting moment, Jonas no longer saw a dog who had been abandoned. He saw a warrior, silent, resilient, and slowly finding his way back to who he once was. That morning, the forest of laurel still seemed half asleep beneath a thick layer of mist. The treetops rustled softly, like ancient curtains drawn over an old memory. The silence was so complete that every crunch of Jonas's boots on dry twigs echoed like the snapping of forgotten time. A light wind moved through the trees, carrying the scent of damp earth, pine sap, and something older still, the smell of things unnamed. Jonas didn't know what compelled him to turn. The path, the narrow trail into the northern woods, was one he had always avoided. Not because it was dangerous, but because it held too much. Memories he wasn't ready for, feelings of powerlessness, and a fear with no name, tied to everything he had once walked away from. But that morning, when he saw Star standing on the porch, head tilted toward the edge of the forest, as if listening for something just beyond reach, he understood. This wasn't his journey alone anymore. They walked without speaking. Their shadows stretched long across the damp ground, weaving between faint beams of light filtering through the canopy. Every step Star took was grounded and sure. He didn't need to look back, but every so often he paused, turned, and met Jonas's eyes as if to ask, "Still with me?" Jonas gave a small nod. No words were needed. He was beginning to understand that Star didn't need saving. Star needed someone to walk beside him, someone who wouldn't pull, wouldn't push, and wouldn't command. Just walk. Just be. That presence, simple and steady, was enough. The path twisted through the woods, roots curling up like fingers reaching from the earth. At times the wind rose and sent waves of dry leaves swirling into the air, momentarily blinding the trail. But Star never slowed. His dark gray coat glistened with morning dew like silver armor. And the way he moved held no trace of captivity, only the quiet strength of a soul who had outlasted his own storm. When they reached a narrow path along the creek where the water whispered against moss-covered stones, Jonas realized something. Star wasn't just walking ahead. He was leading. Not with dominance, but with a kind of grace, shaped by freedom that had once been stolen. And even though neither said a word, something inside Jonas began to soften. It felt like every step Star took was gently unwinding the knots inside him, the kinds of wounds no one else could see, but that still hurt all the same. A dry branch cracked beneath Jonas's boot. He froze. Star stopped too, ears upright, eyes locking back. For a few seconds they stood still, watching each other. Then they moved on. No signal, no cue, just a shared breath, a shared rhythm. And from far off, the sun reached down. A shaft of warm light broke through the clouds, catching the fine dew on Star's coat. It shimmered like gold over gray, and for a brief, aching moment, Jonas saw him clearly. Not as a stray, not as a survivor, but as something more. A warrior, quiet, unbreakable, and walking, step by step, toward himself again. From the moment their two shadows walked side by side through the forest, something inside Jonas began to shift. He was no longer the guide. He was the one learning to observe. They ventured deeper into the heart of Laurel, where the trees grew tighter together and the air thickened with the scent of rotting leaves. A large boulder blocked the path, forcing them to veer off and follow the edge of a shallow creek, slick with patches of moss. Jonas sat down against an old pine trunk, catching his breath, sweat darkening the collar of his shirt. Star remained on his feet, ears perked high, eyes scanning the woods like a silent sentinel. Neither spoke, yet both could hear the language of the forest, rustling leaves, distant bird cries, and then something else. A low, guttural growl rolled out from the thicket across the stream, sharp and menacing. Jonas turned instantly, and then it emerged, a massive stray dog lunging from the shadows. Its fur bristled dark gray and wild, eyes red with fury, lips curled back over bared teeth. A wolf-dog hybrid, maybe. A creature abandoned between instinct and memory, half wild and half forgotten. Jonas started to back away, but Star moved first. No bark, no growl, just one step forward, placing himself between Jonas and the threat. His back arched, fur raised, legs braced solid against the earth, his head lowered, eyes locked on the intruder. In that moment, the cabin, the forest, even the past faded. There were only two beings and the raw instinct to survive. The wild dog lunged. The sound tore through the clearing like ripping canvas. But Star didn't flinch. He sprang, twisting mid-air with a fluid grace, dodging the attack and landing a precise bite at the side of the other dog's neck. It wasn't meant to kill, just enough to throw the opponent off balance. The fight lasted no more than 10 seconds, but to Jonas it stretched like slow motion. Every movement Star made was clean and deliberate. No panic, no rage, only the cold precision of a creature who had faced fear before and learned how to master it. The stray yelped, spun, and fled into the deeper forest. Star didn't chase. He stood his ground, ears still up, breath heavy and controlled. Then he turned. His eyes met Jonas's. Jonas stood frozen, not from fear, but from awe. For the first time he understood the true power in Star, not in the strength of his bite, but in the choice not to continue the violence. That was the strength of someone who had endured. And now choose to rise without inflicting more pain. The wind moved gently through the trees again. Star walked back toward Jonas. No pride, no seeking praise, just presence, a quiet kind of companionship. And Jonas, wordless, placed a steady hand on Star's shoulder. Once more, nothing needed to be said. The battle had passed. But inside Jonas, something was only just beginning. Star's last glance back held no fear, no arrogance. That look clear, calm, and unwavering rooted Jonas to the ground. The fight was over, but its echo inside him was like an old roar returning. Not about survival, but about reclaiming something once lost. On the path home, the forest seemed changed. No longer a labyrinth of twisted shadows, no longer a hiding place for fear. It had become a quiet stage, where two souls had walked through an unseen trial and come out the other side not untouched, but transformed. Jonas no longer walked ahead. He moved beside Star now, as if everything before had only been the prelude to something real, the beginning of true companionship. The sun had risen higher. Light streamed through the treetops in golden ribbons, falling randomly across Star's back. His fur was still damp with dew, streaked with bits of soil and leaf, yet his steps carried a quiet grace. Star didn't glance back, didn't check. Every stride felt calm, as if the forest had never held shadows at all. Jonas tilted his head slightly, watching him. It wasn't pity anymore, nor sympathy. It was admiration, pure and unhidden. In that moment, Jonas realized something he hadn't before. He had believed all this time that Star needed him to heal. But in truth, it was Jonas who had been mending, piece by piece, held together by a creature who had once been even more broken than he was. They crossed through a low clearing, the grass brushing against their boots and paws. The sound of wind tapping against the pines echoed in the distance. Neither said a word. But in the silence, each breath, every pause in their walk, and the subtle tilt of Star's head became a language of its own, simple, but deeply real. Jonas stopped beneath an old elm, a place he used to end his walks when he went alone. He eased himself down at the base, back against the rough bark, eyes gently closed. Star didn't lie down. He remained standing just half an arm's length away, ears high, eyes fixed on something distant. The wind brushed across their shoulders, and for the first time, Jonas didn't whisper to himself, but aloud. "You don't need me to protect you," he said. "I'm the one who needs to learn how to survive again." Star didn't reply, but his tail gave a faint movement, not a wag of joy, but a quiet signal, a sign that he heard and understood. When they reached the cabin porch, the wood glowed in the late afternoon sun. It no longer looked like a place to hide. Just as Jonas was about to step up the stairs, he stopped. A man stood there, broad-shouldered, weathered face marked by years. In his hand, a piece of paper with the corners worn and smudged. And at the center was Star. Star froze too, no whine, no bark, but his body stiffened, back arched, and ears locked forward. Then came a low growl, soft, brief, but tight as a bowstring pulled to its breaking point. Jonas glanced at Star, then turned to the man, and in that moment, he knew. The past wasn't finished, and a new chapter was about to begin. Not just for Star, but for him as well. The wind rolled through Laurel again, carrying a chill that hinted at something unnamed, not yet spoken. After that quiet growl, the porch seemed to freeze in place. Jonas didn't move. Star didn't either. Only the stranger took one step closer, his boots tapping lightly on the wooden boards. He wasn't tall, but there was strength in his gait. He stopped just a few paces away, holding the paper at chest height. It was torn at the edge, but the image was clear. A younger Star, a different coat, a different look in his eyes. And in the corner of the page, printed at a slant, were the words, "Missing evidence in case file R09411, request for return." Jonas froze. Something inside him rang out like an alarm bell. It wasn't just the paper in the man's hand. It was the look in his eyes, a gaze that had seen too much and forgotten nothing. Cold, controlled, familiar. "That dog," the man said, voice dry and low, "used to belong to a special unit." He wasn't a pet. He was evidence. Star didn't look away. The fur along his spine bristled, ready for something. But he didn't move. He just stood there, as if waiting for a trigger. "My name is Harlan Vex," the man continued. "I used to work in the advanced K-9 conditioning program for the state of Wyoming. Star, or K217, as listed in the records, was part of our high-tolerance endurance trials. He disappeared along with a missing transport in 2020. The words hit Jonas like a drop in his chest. He didn't need to ask more. The cargo, the metal crate, that broken, muffled cry, and that look. "Who sent you?" Jonas asked, his voice rough. "We've been using thermal imaging from local satellites," Harlan replied. "Recently picked up unusual signals from a biological unit matching Star's profile. I came to confirm." Star stepped back slightly, ears still alert. But now his eyes had shifted, not toward Harlan. Toward Jonas, and Jonas understood. It wasn't fear. It wasn't an apology. It was a choice. Once again, Star was choosing to stay in the one place he believed he could be himself. "He's not anyone's property anymore," Jonas said, voice steady. "He's not evidence. He's not a case number. His name is Star. And if you're here to take him back, you're in the wrong place." Harlan's hand tightened around the flyer. "I didn't come here to cause trouble. But if the old organizations find out, they won't let it go. Some things aren't allowed to disappear." "And some things," Jonas said, eyes never leaving Star, "should never be owned." A chill swept across the porch again. Harlan folded the flyer slowly and slid it into his coat pocket. He looked at Star one last time, not with the eyes of a handler, but like someone watching a door quietly close. "Keep him safe," he said under his breath, then turned away. His footsteps faded behind the old pines, leaving the porch in silence. Star stepped forward just once toward Jonas. His tail gave a slight movement, no growl, just a long, steady breath. And once again, two living souls stood side by side. No one is chasing. No one is running. Only one choice remained. And from that moment on, Jonas understood. The past could always catch up, but the present that was something they could choose to hold together. The afternoon wind swept through the laurel woods, carrying with it a chill that hinted at something unnamed. After the low, warning growl from Star, the entire porch seemed to freeze in place. Jonas didn't move. Neither did Star. Only the stranger took a slow, deliberate step forward, his boots brushing dust across the old wooden boards. The man wasn't particularly tall, but his gait was solid. He stopped a few feet from Jonas and Star, still holding the paper raised at chest level. The flyer was weathered, one corner torn, but the image in the center was unmistakable. It was Star at another time, with different fur and a different look in his eyes. Printed across the top corner in slanted block letters were the words, "Missing evidence in case number R-09-411, request for immediate return." Jonas stiffened. Inside him, something rang sharp and urgent, not just because of what was written, but because of the man's eyes to eyes that had seen too much and forgotten nothing. Cold, contained, and disturbingly familiar. "That dog," the man said, his voice low and dry, "once belonged to a special unit. He wasn't just a pet. He's evidence." Star didn't look away. The fur along his shoulders bristled, his whole body poised for something unseen. But he didn't leap forward. He simply stood there, still and watching, like he was waiting for the truth to surface. "My name is Harlan Vex," the man continued. "I was part of the high-intensity K-9 training program in Wyoming. Star, or, as he's listed in the records, K-217, was part of our endurance protocol. He disappeared along with a shipment that went off-grid in 2020. As soon as he said it, Jonas felt the floor drop out inside him. He didn't need more details. The shipment, the steel crate, the muffled howling, and those eyes. "Who told you to come here?" Jonas asked, his voice rough and dry. "We've been using localized thermal imaging from our satellite grid. Recently, there's been an irregular heat signature matching a biological imprint near this elevation. I came to verify." Star took a step back. His ears were still perked. But now his gaze had shifted not toward Harlan, but toward Jonas. And Jonas understood. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't fear. It was a choice. One more time, Star was choosing to stay in the one place he believed he could still be whole. "He doesn't belong to anyone anymore," Jonas said, the words deliberate and heavy. "He's not evidence. He's not a case number. His name is Star. And if you're here to take him back, then you're lost." Harlan's fingers tightened around the flyer. I'm not here to make a scene, but if the old networks find out, they won't just let it go. Some things can't be left behind." "Some things," Jonas replied, eyes still fixed on Star, "were never meant to be owned." The breeze rustled again, stirring the dust along the porch. Harlan slowly folded the flyer and slid it into his coat pocket. He looked at Star one last time, not like a handler sizing up an asset, but like someone staring at a door that had finally closed. "Keep him safe," he said quietly, then turned and walked away. His footsteps faded behind the trees, swallowed by the silence of the woods. Star stepped forward just a little toward Jonas. His tail gave the faintest motion. No growl, just a steady breath, long and slow, and once again 2 lives stood side by side. No one chasing, no one is fleeing. Only one thing left between them: choice. A cold wind swept once more across the porch. Harlan folded the flyer and slipped it into his coat pocket. He looked at Star one last time, not like a man giving orders, but like someone watching a door quietly close behind him. "Keep him safe," he said softly, then turned and walked away. His figure disappeared beyond the old pines, leaving the porch in stillness. Star stepped forward, moving closer to Jonas. His tail gave a small, silent sway. No growl, just a deep, steady breath. And once again, 2 living beings stood together. No more being hunted, no more running. What remained between them was choice. And in that moment, Jonas understood. The past might catch up, but the present, that was something they could hold on to, together. That morning, autumn had painted the small town streets in golden light. The maple trees were shedding their leaves like quiet sighs, spreading a bright yellow carpet beneath the footsteps of early walkers. The air was warm, yet carried the faint scent of parting, the scent of a season, slowly closing its doors. Jonas walked Star down the main street, his pace unhurried. Star trotted beside him, steady and silent, moving like he belonged to these nameless streets, no leash, no commands, just 2 souls sharing a peaceful morning. The town was just waking up to the gentle clinking of coffee cups from open cafes, the quiet voices of people heading to work, and the scent of fresh brew mixing with warm pastries floating on the breeze. Jonas stopped in front of a small roadside cafe, one he visited every week. He nodded to the owner, a silver-haired man with a kind smile, then stepped inside. Star remained on the sidewalk, sitting beside an old wooden bench faded by years of sunlight. He sat straight, his eyes trained on the road, like he was keeping watch over something precious. His gaze followed the passing crowd, not with suspicion, not with tension, just a calm, awake presence. A little girl, no older than 6, came skipping across the street, hugging a red cloth ball, giggling as she tossed it gently from hand to hand. Her mother, at the register behind her, turned and called out, "Don't go too far!" But the warning hadn't even finished when a sharp car horn rang out from the corner, fast, shrill, and full of alarm. The red ball slipped from the girl's hands and bounced into the street just as traffic began to build. Her tiny legs dashed after it without hesitation, guided only by instinct. And at that very second, a gray delivery truck came speeding around the curve, its headlights catching the windshield like a flash of fire. The tires screamed against the pavement. A piercing screech tore through the quiet morning. Everything seemed to freeze in that breathless moment, and from the edge of the sidewalk, Star sprang to life. There was no bark, no growl, just one clean motion, a leap, like an arrow cutting through the narrow space between danger and the life that hadn't yet learned fear. No one in the crowd could move fast enough to stop what was happening. They only watched, mouths open, as the gray blur of fur launched into the street, slicing through time and sound, aiming straight for the heart of the storm. The truck hadn't stopped. Its tires screeched, sliding across the asphalt and leaving behind the bitter stench of scorched rubber. And in that breathless second, right in front of the speeding grill, Star made it. Still glowing under the pale gold of the morning light, still holding that same steady, focused gaze, Star bit down on the collar of the little girl's shirt, pivoted, and with one powerful motion spun her out of danger and onto the sidewalk. It all happened in the blink of an eye. The child hit the ground crying, but she was whole. Safe. And Star stood there, right in the heart of the road, shrouded in the haze of burnt smoke. All four legs braced. His breath was heavy, his eyes searching for Jonas. That was the moment the world started paying attention. But for Star, it was just a moment that needed to happen. And so he made it happen. In a heartbeat suspended between screeching rubber and held breath, Star had launched himself into the street like a streak of silver through fog. But what had just taken place didn't end there. That act, that raw instinct, had pierced something far deeper than flesh or air. It had reached into the heart of a town slowly numbed by indifference. And from that second forward, everything began to shift in ways none of them could have predicted. Star stood still in the middle of the street, smoke curling around him like battlefield mist. The little girl clutched her red cloth ball, sobbing into her mother's arms. The block had gone silent. No one could quite believe what they had just witnessed. A few people started pulling out their phones, not to call for help, but to capture what they already knew would never repeat. Jonas rushed forward, dropped to his knees, and wrapped his arms tightly around Star. It wasn't the embrace of a pet owner. It was the grasp of one soul holding on to another, both of them shaken from the razor-thin line between life and loss. A traffic officer arrived on the scene, ready to shout for the crowd to clear the street, but he stopped short. His eyes met Star's. There was no begging in that stare, no tremble, only a steady, quiet presence. Deep, grounded. "I got it! I got the whole thing!" A teenage voice stammered behind them, holding up a phone with trembling hands. That one sentence sparked a wave. The video spread fast, edited, slowed, and paired with soft music. Then it rolled like an unstoppable tide across every platform. Four-legged warrior, the nickname, began to appear everywhere. News anchors recounted the story each evening. Footage of Star was looped on national broadcasts with headlines like, "Hero Dog Saves Child from Oncoming Truck." Special features aired. Witness interviews flooded in. And that now iconic clip of Star standing tall in the middle of the road, eyes unwavering, struck viewers into silence. But for Jonas, as he returned to the cabin that night, none of it made as much sense as the one thing that kept echoing in his chest. It wasn't the fame. It wasn't the rescue. It was that look in Star's eyes. It hadn't said, "I just saved someone." It had said, "I just remembered who I am." As the sun dipped behind the trees, Star lay on the porch, gently licking the dried blood on his paw. Jonas sat beside him, quiet, eyes watching the dirt trail that led back into town. Out there, the numbers were climbing. Views, shares, headlines. But inside the cabin, something else had begun to rise. Not fear. No hesitation. Something softer. Something Jonas hadn't felt in a long time. Something dangerously close to faith. The video was under 30 seconds. It hit TikTok within an hour. The hashtag #4-legged warrior shot to the top of the trending list. People everywhere were reposting it with captions like, "If today made you lose faith in the world, watch this." Thousands of views turned into millions. Local news started covering it with headlines like, "Dog saves child in a split second." And then came the national media. But they weren't looking for the little girl. They were looking for Star. The media storm came crashing in, as if it were the only natural response to an act too pure, too brave to be ignored. Footage from multiple angles surfaced. Emotional music was layered in. Titles flashed across the screen. Everyday hero. Some called Star an angel on 4 legs. Others said he was a symbol of quiet courage. Jonas didn't use social media. But he knew something was happening when he saw 2 vans with network logos parked near the narrow trail to his cabin. A young reporter stood at the wooden door, microphone in hand, eyes bright with anticipation. In the other hand was an iPad, frozen on the frame of Star turning his head to look at Jonas after saving the child. The caption below read, "More than instinct." From behind the curtain, Jonas watched. Star lay by the doorway, head resting on his paws, expression unchanged, as if none of this had anything to do with him. But Jonas knew. The storm had come. And this time, it wouldn't be easy to outlast. He sat beside the window, cradling a mug of cold coffee. Star rested nearby, the cut on his leg now wrapped in clean cloth. It wasn't deep, just a scratch. But to Jonas it felt like a quiet reminder of the price of choice. He remembered the night he brought Star home. The trembling figure huddled in a corner of the cabin, shadows clinging to every inch of him. That night, Jonas had crouched down and whispered, almost under his breath, "No one's going to touch you again." A simple promise, but one that built an invisible wall between Star and the world. Now, with cameras inching closer and strangers reaching for interviews, Jonas found himself wondering, had that promise been protection, or had it been possession? Was it merely a covert measure to shield Star from public scrutiny? He wasn't afraid of the media. What terrified him were the questions. The quiet, innocent questions that had the power to dig up a life he'd tried to bury. He didn't want anyone learning about the years he worked for a shady transport unit, where dogs like Star were listed on forms with no names. He didn't want to admit he'd signed off on shipments without asking what they contained. But then Star raised his head, gently placed it on Jonas's lap. No demand, no hesitation, just presence. And in that moment, every fear softened. There were no headlines in Star's gaze, no judgment, just one quiet question that lingered in the silence between them. Are the good things worth telling? Jonas stood, walked to the door. Star followed. No command needed. When Jonas gripped the handle, the hinges creaked like an old memory breathing out one last time. He opened the door, not to step into the spotlight, but because Star had shown him something deeper, that some truths, if never spoken, don't just disappear. They become wounds that never stop aching. Jonas rose to his feet, walked toward the door. Star stayed close, every step silent and sure. When Jonas turned the old handle, the rusty hinge let out a long, aching creak like the past itself groaning open. He opened the door, not to be seen. But because Star had taught him something no one else ever could. Some truths, if left untold, don't fade. They fester. They become wounds that never stop bleeding. The door had barely been open 5 minutes when the air erupted with the rapid-fire flashes of cameras, flickering like lightning in a summer storm. Jonas didn't step out onto the lawn. He stayed right there on the wooden porch, one hand resting lightly on Star's shoulder, like an anchor for both of them. Below the steps, lenses aimed like searchlights, eyes darted, voices buzzed. A young reporter raised her hand, firing off questions in a breathless rush. "Are you the owner of the dog in the video? Can you tell us more about him?" Just days ago, Jonas had believed this cabin life would be the final wall between his past and the present. But the moment Star leapt into the street, clamped his jaws on a child's collar, and pulled her from the path of a speeding truck, something shifted. A door was opened. one that could never quite be closed again. And in Star's eyes, in that moment, there was no plea for recognition. Just the quiet certainty of a soul who knew the worth of his own choice. Jonas didn't answer right away. Star sat still beside him, perfectly calm. No command needed, no signals exchanged. Jonas looked down at Star, then raised his head. His voice was steady, almost soft. "His name is Star," Jonas said, "and I don't think I'm his owner. I think I'm just the one who found him when he needed someone. And maybe I needed him too." The reporter hadn't expected that kind of answer, but she didn't stop. Another voice followed up quickly, louder, more pointed. "How does a dog act like a trained soldier? Can you tell us more about his past?" Jonas paused again. The wind stirred lightly through the pines. Star remained still, but his ears twitched, sensing the weight of what hung in the air. Jonas tilted his head slightly, drew a deep breath, and gave the smallest nod as if granting himself permission to open a door he'd sealed long ago. "Star didn't used to be Star," he began. "He was a number, a test subject, a living tool locked in cages and trained for endurance. I didn't hurt him directly, but I was the one behind the wheel, delivering sealed crates I was told not to ask about." Silence. The cameras kept rolling, but the sounds of the forest began to swallow everything else. Jonas went on, his voice low and deliberate, like tracing old wounds with his fingers. "I once opened the wrong crate by mistake. Inside was a pair of eyes, not wild, not broken, but aware. Aware of fear, of pain, and of silence. I shut that crate fast, but those eyes never left me." He looked down at Star, who was now gazing up at him. He didn't save that girl for applause. He saved her because he knew, if he didn't run, there wouldn't be time. And this time, he chose not to stay silent. 4 days after the video went viral, when the applause still echoed through comment threads and hearts around the country were still stirred by the rescue, an envelope slid under the cabin door. No return address, no signature. Inside was no interview request, no thank you letter. Only a whisper, something soft, something from the dark. The door hadn't been open for 5 minutes when the flash of cameras burst like lightning in a summer storm. Jonas didn't step fully into the yard. He stayed on the porch, one hand resting lightly on Star's shoulder, grounding them both. Below the steps, lenses pointed like searchlights, eyes buzzed with curiosity, and voices tangled in anticipation. A young reporter raised her hand, eager and quick. "Are you the owner of the dog in the video? Can you tell us something about him?" Just days ago, Jonas had believed this cabin would forever shield him from the weight of his past. But the moment Star bolted into the street, gripped the child's collar, and pulled her from the jaws of a speeding truck, something changed. A door swung open, one that could never be closed again. Star's eyes in that moment hadn't begged for applause. They spoke of something else, a soul who knew exactly what his actions meant. Jonas didn't answer right away. Star sat beside him, calm and still. No command was needed. No sign. Jonas glanced down at Star, then back at the crowd. "His name is Star," Jonas said gently, "and I wouldn't say I'm his owner. I'm just someone who met him when he needed someone. And maybe I needed him too." The reporters hadn't expected that kind of answer, but they didn't back off either. Another question came, sharper, faster. "But how did he act like such a trained warrior? Can you tell us about his past?" Jonas stayed quiet for a moment longer. The wind hissed softly through the pines. Star didn't move, but his ears shifted ever so slightly, as if he too could feel the weight of the question. Jonas tilted his head, took in a long breath, and nodded. A quiet agreement with himself to finally open a door long sealed. "Star wasn't always Star," he said. "He was a number, a test subject, a being locked in a cage and treated like a tool. I didn't do it to him directly, but I was the one behind the wheel. I drove the trucks, I delivered the crates. I wasn't allowed to ask what was inside. The crowd fell completely still. Cameras rolled, but the sounds of the forest began to fill the silence. Jonas went on, his voice slow, like walking back through a nightmare. Once, I opened the wrong crate, just for a second, and I saw eyes. Not wild, not crazed. Eyes that knew fear, knew pain, and knew how to be silent. I shut the lid. But those eyes, they've never left me. And when I met Star, I recognized them. It was him. He paused, looking down at Star, who was gazing up at him with the same steady calm that had saved a life. He didn't save that girl to be applauded. He saved her because he knew. If he didn't act, it would be too late. And this time, he chose not to stay silent. 4 days after the video went viral, while the echoes of applause and emotional comments still floated across every corner of the internet, a nameless envelope slipped quietly through the crack beneath the cabin door. It wasn't a fan letter. It wasn't a media request. Inside was a whisper from the dark. Inside the envelope was a single photo. A black and white image, old and blurred at the edges, showing a row of kennels deep in the forest. The air in the picture felt heavy, like it was holding its breath. Cold, still, and eerily quiet. On the back of the photo, scribbled in blue ballpoint pen, were only a few haunting words. I'm still alive, and I still remember. It was like someone had reached into Jonas's chest and pulled him backward in time, dragging him through memories he had buried so deep they no longer had names. His shoulders stiffened, and his hands began to tremble slightly, so faintly he barely noticed. In the quiet of the cabin, filled with the scent of old wood and cold ash, the only sound was the wind whispering through the cracks of the door, bearing silent witness to a moment that refused to stay forgotten. Star walked in from the yard, his paws soft against the wooden floor. He didn't bark, didn't growl, just moved toward Jonas with quiet certainty, gently laying his head across Jonas's leg and breathing slow, steady breaths. His ears folded back, and his eyes drifted toward the photo on the table, as if even Star could sense the ghost inside that picture, a ghost neither of them had ever really left behind. Jonas rose suddenly and walked into the back room. The creak of the old cabinet groaned like something half asleep waking again. He yanked it open and rifled through layers of brittle paper until his fingers touched a worn, brown folder. The edges were frayed, the color faded into the texture of dust and time. The smell of old ink and damp paper rose as he opened it. From between the pages, a photo slipped out and fell onto the floor. There it was, the behavioral test site, nestled deep in the northern forest. A place Jonas once drove into under orders. A place he was told never to ask about, never to look, never to remember. But someone out there was remembering for him, not with threats, not with noise, just with a signal, a nudge, to remind him that memory may blur, but truth never really disappears. And now, that truth was knocking, waiting to be told. Jonas sat for hours after that, silent. His mind spun through questions he couldn't answer. Who sent it? Why now? What else was waiting? But one thing he knew for sure. This wasn't just about him anymore. Not about a dog who saved a child or a man who once lost his way. The wind had shifted, and the wind never changes without carrying something new. By the time the sun sank behind the trees, Jonas stood. He didn't lock the cabin. Star rose beside him, padding quietly into the yard like he already understood. No orders were needed. No leashes. Just steps slow, sure, and steady like breathing. If someone out there needs us to tell another piece of the truth, Jonas whispered, eyes locked on the path at the forest's edge. Then this time, we'll tell it all. The wind moved through the treetops, carrying with it the scent of moss, pine, and the coming night. Star looked up at Jonas, and in his eyes wasn't fear or hesitation. It was readiness. That forest ahead had once been the place Jonas ran to forget. But standing there beside Star, with the last light of day casting golden shadows across the damp ground, he finally understood. Some places aren't made for hiding. They're made for returning, for facing the past and speaking its name in the very first light of tomorrow. That morning, the mist hung thick across the forest canopy, draping the cabin like a damp blanket of memories that hadn't been folded away. Everything felt heavier, like the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something unspoken to rise again. Inside the cabin, Jonas sat quietly in front of the cold fireplace, his eyes locked on a piece of yellowed paper. No signature, no sender, just one line scribbled in fading ink. Meet me at 9 p.m., same place. It had been 4 days since Star appeared on the front pages. 4 days of silence to the outside world, but a storm of noise inside Jonas, stirred further by the black and white photo, that jagged note, and the quietest kind of threat, one carried not in words, but in memories long buried. Tonight, all the questions pointed to one place. Star lay at his feet, staring out through the fogged-up window like he already understood, even before Jonas said a word. There was no plan to be made, no command to give. Some journeys don't begin with a decision. They begin with companionship. Jonas quietly packed a few rations, checked the flashlight batteries, and slid a small knife into his belt. As the sun dipped behind the hills, he stood up. Star rose too, noiselessly. They left through the back door, heading north along a trail that led into a forest Jonas had tried to forget, a path lined not with direction but with avoidance. They moved past twisted turns, dry branches snapping underfoot, where the moon had just pushed through the clouds, casting light on the forgotten trail that wound toward an old, abandoned training compound. The air grew thick with mildew and cold earth, so dense it felt like the forest itself was struggling to conceal its secrets. When Jonas's watch hummed softly to mark 9 p.m., they were already there, standing before a rusted iron gate, once the entrance to a world built to be erased. Jonas and Star reached the old grounds. The gate creaked open with a moan that sounded like the woods themselves whispering a warning. The place was blanketed in dust. As Jonas pushed forward, the hinges screamed softly, their voice brittle and familiar. From a shadowed corridor between the forgotten kennels, a figure stepped out. Tall, worn brown coat, half his face was hidden in the dark. As he drew closer, Jonas saw it, the scar across his hand. A deep, unmistakable cut from the days they used to drive together, hauling whatever the paperwork said not to question. "I figured you'd remember," the man said, his voice like a knife in the quiet. "Remember the eyes in that crate?" Star let out a low, rasped breath. Not a growl, not a charge, but his eyes burned straight through the man, like cutting through decades of dust. "I'm here to say," Jonas replied, steady and low. "I'm going to tell everything. Who lived, who died, who was erased. I'm bringing it all into the light." The man shrugged, turning slowly toward the dark. "Then get ready, Jonas. They're all going to come back." His silhouette disappeared beyond the broken walls, swallowed by the night beyond the compound. Jonas stood still, not from fear, but reverence. Star stood beside him, unmoving, as if he too knew this was not a moment to step forward, but one to absorb. That brief encounter stirred up more than memories. It stirred a reckoning. On the walk home, Jonas didn't speak. Star walked close, never straying. The moonlight, diffused by lingering mist, cast soft rings of light on the damp path ahead, like the fading lines of a story just beginning to be remembered. They didn't need to talk. Their steps were synchronized. Their silence was agreement. The message came in at 3 a.m. No sender. Just one short line. "If you won't speak, we will." Jonas stared at the glowing screen. That cold blue light washed over the stubble on his face, casting long shadows across the exhaustion etched into every line of him. Only a few days ago, he and Star had stood on the cabin porch, surrounded by a crowd of reporters, their voices sharp with curiosity and questions. Back then, the truth was still behind a thin curtain. You could see the light behind it, faint and flickering, but it wasn't time yet. Jonas hadn't found the courage to pull it open all the way. But then came the old photograph, the scrawled handwriting, the silent threat, and the weight of memory crashing back like a wave. And Jonas knew right then if he didn't step forward, the past would come knocking anyway. It wouldn't wait for permission. Outside, the sky was still dark. Star sat by the porch, head held high, ears standing alert. Jonas didn't need to ask. Star felt it too, that subtle shift in the air, like roots pushing through soil after a long storm. The quiet peace they had was slipping away, replaced by something deeper. Something old. Jonas wasn't afraid. Not really. What he felt was closer to a reckoning, like someone who once owed a debt, and now had nowhere left to run. He sat at his old desk, fingers moving slowly across the keyboard. The first name he typed was the one that started it all. The name of the organization he once worked for. The place where dogs were numbered, not named. He dug through the dusty files again, flipping through yellowed papers that were supposed to have been erased from the world. Code numbers, intake dates, behavior charts, brief notes without signatures. And then, tucked between the pages, a photograph. Faded, grainy. Star locked in a cage, staring at the camera. Not scared, not hopeful, just empty. That moment from the other night still haunted him. The old black and white photo, the scribbled words. It wasn't just a memory anymore, it was a call, and Jonas could no longer meet that call with silence. He began pinning the documents to the wooden walls of the cabin, one page at a time, slowly turning the space into something that looked like an investigation board. The kind you'd see in a film, where every thread led back to something buried. The walls started filling up with paper, each sheet a fragment of a forgotten truth. Outside, the early wind slipped through the pine trees, seeping through the cracks in the cabin. The sound it made was strange, cold, almost whispering. Inside, Star watched him quietly, not barking, not pacing, just watching, as if each page Jonas hung was something Star already knew, but could never say. In that low light, Star's eyes weren't lost anymore. They held something steady, a silence that wasn't defeat, but deep companionship. Jonas sorted the files. Star stayed near, one man piecing together what had been shattered, one soul, quiet but loyal, refusing to turn away. Inside that small cabin, the truth was starting to take shape, and Jonas knew now that he couldn't close that door alone. When he posted the first story, not under his real name, but with a made-up one, the response came fast. Some confirmed what he wrote, others added names, and some messages came from the shadows. A quiet promise, sealed by the forest, beneath a sky that had finally let the truth begin breathing again. Jonas knew deep down that what just happened wasn't just a conversation with an old ghost from the past. It was a bell tolling in the distance, shaking loose a truth that had slept far too long. The forest in front of him no longer felt like a place to bury secrets. It was something else now. It was an entrance, a threshold to something not yet born but waiting, a journey of reckoning, of renewal. And Star, without saying a single word, had already chosen to walk that path with him. This time Jonas wasn't going to run. Not anymore. The message came in at 3 a.m. No sender. Just one short line. "If you won't speak, we will." Jonas stared at the glowing screen. That cold blue light washed over the stubble on his face, casting long shadows across the exhaustion etched into every line of him. Only a few days ago, he and Star had stood on the cabin porch, surrounded by a crowd of reporters, their voices sharp with curiosity and questions. Back then, the truth was still behind a thin curtain. You could see the light behind it, faint and flickering, but it wasn't time yet. Jonas hadn't found the courage to pull it open all the way. But then came the old photograph, the scrawled handwriting, the silent threat and the weight of memory crashing back like a wave. And Jonas knew right then if he didn't step forward, the past would come knocking anyway. It wouldn't wait for permission. Outside, the sky was still dark. Star sat by the porch, head held high, ears standing alert. Jonas didn't need to ask. Star felt it too, that subtle shift in the air, like roots pushing through soil after a long storm. The quiet peace they had was slipping away, replaced by something deeper, something old. Jonas wasn't afraid. Not really. What he felt was closer to a reckoning, like someone who once owed a debt and now had nowhere left to run. He sat at his old desk, fingers moving slowly across the keyboard. The first name he typed was the one that started it all. The name of the organization he once worked for. The place where dogs were numbered, not named. He dug through the dusty files again, flipping through yellowed papers that were supposed to have been erased from the world. Code numbers, intake dates, behavior charts, brief notes without signatures. And then, tucked between the pages, a photograph. Faded. Grainy. Star, locked in a cage, staring at the camera. Not scared, not hopeful. Just empty. That moment from the other night still haunted him. The old black and white photo. The scribbled words. It wasn't just a memory anymore. It was a call. And Jonas could no longer meet that call with silence. He began pinning the documents to the wooden walls of the cabin. One page at a time. Slowly turning the space into something that looked like an investigation board. The kind you'd see in a film, where every thread led back to something buried. The walls started filling up with paper, each sheet a fragment of a forgotten truth. Outside, the early wind slipped through the pine trees, seeping through the cracks in the cabin. The sound it made was strange and cold, almost whispering. Inside, Star watched him quietly, not barking, not pacing, just watching, as if each page Jonas hung was something Star already knew but could never say. In that low light, Star's eyes weren't lost anymore. They held something steady. A silence that wasn't defeat, but deep companionship. Jonas sorted the files. Star stayed near, one man piecing together what had been shattered, one soul, quiet but loyal, refusing to turn away. Inside that small cabin, the truth was starting to take shape. And Jonas knew now that he couldn't close that door alone. When he posted the first story, not under his real name, but with a made-up one, the response came fast. Some confirmed what he wrote, others added names, and some messages came from the shadows. From places Jonas never expected, the responses began to arrive. "I used to work there. I still have a copy. They think no one remembers, but I never forgot." The truth didn't break through in a single burst. It flickered into life, ember by ember, as one voice after another emerged from the silence. Jonas read every word, saved every screenshot, printed each one and pinned it to the cabin wall. Every page became a voice, every piece of proof a heartbeat. Star stayed by his side through it all. Sometimes Jonas would place a hand gently on Star's head, a silent thank you that didn't need to be said. Other times, he just sat there, eyes closed, listening to the hush of the forest wind and the quiet rhythm of Star's breathing beside him. A silent promise between two souls who had once known pain too well. From across the country, more stories began to surface, fragments of the past rising from the shadows, blurred-out addresses, old, fading images. A woman from Minnesota sent him the intake file of a dog who died during one of the earliest test phases. A former driver, just like Jonas, wrote, "I used to think I was just doing a job. Now I know. I was quiet for too long." Jonas began to map it all out, every date and detail, arranging the pages by time. The little cabin, once a place to hide, now stood at the center of an investigation no one had officially started, but everyone who joined in understood. Once the truth has a shape, it cannot be torn down again. And as the first light of morning crept through the window, Jonas knew one thing for sure. They were no longer alone. And this story, once told, would not be silenced. When the first light of morning slipped through the cabin window, Jonas knew they were no longer alone, and the story they had started could no longer be paused. He had felt it the night before, in the quiet weight of Star's gaze and the way the final breeze drifted through the pines. This return wasn't a retreat. It was the first true step into something new. A beginning not forged by escape, but by the will to rebuild, not just for Star, but for every soul that had ever been forgotten. For nights on end, Jonas sat at the wooden table, sketches scattered beneath the warm glow of a single lamp. None of the drawings were final, but each pencil stroke carried something unshakable. Enclosures with no locks, doors that didn't need bolts, recovery spaces free from screams, built with soft earth and morning light. He named the place Hope Ridge, not by coincidence. It was the highest point along the forest's eastern edge, where the sunrise always touched first. Jonas chose it not for ease, but because he believed whoever crossed that threshold first should know exactly where the light begins. After locking away the old files and naming the memories not with fear, but with courage, Jonas knew words alone would never be enough. He needed something tangible, something real. So the next morning, while the fog still curled along the trail, Jonas and Star headed east toward the ridge where day always begins. When Star stepped onto that patch of earth, there was no ceremony, no crowd, no camera lens waiting to catch the moment. Just Jonas, a faded backpack, and a pair of worn hands holding a shovel. Star didn't hesitate. His ears stood tall, his eyes scanned the stillness. Then he looked at Jonas, not asking for direction but offering quiet affirmation. This place was right. Jonas marked the land with wooden stakes, stretching a fence that defined space but never trapped it. He raised a modest A-frame shelter using bamboo and repurposed oilcloth. After each section was built, he would sit beside Star, hand resting gently on his back, as if seeking wordless approval from the first one to call this place home. As the shape of the land slowly emerged, the wind softened. Birds called to each other in the treetops, their songs no longer drowned by hammer strikes. Star lay stretched across the clearing, eyes barely open, ears still attentive. The first sunlight filtered through the branches and settled between Star's front paws, as if even the sun had come to acknowledge him. Not a coincidence. But a moment the world had quietly waited for when a creature once hidden in the shadows became the soul standing at the gate of a world without cages. A world where the door didn't lock behind you. It opened for you. And it meant welcome. That morning, no one called. No one gave notice. But Star woke earlier than usual, his eyes fixed on the winding dirt road that led to Hope Ridge. Jonas, standing by the stove pouring coffee, glanced out and caught that familiar posture in Star's stance, not fear, not excitement, just a quiet attention, like he was listening for the echo of an old promise. By noon, an old silver pickup pulled up at the bottom of the hill. The door creaked open, and an elderly man stepped out. Behind him came a smaller figure, a little girl, maybe 10 years old. They both stood still for a long moment, just looking. Not walking forward, not speaking. As if trying to decide if this place could possibly be real. Jonas stepped outside, Star by his side. The wind carried a hint of fresh grass between them. The man said nothing. He just stared at Star for a long time, then leaned down and whispered something to the girl. She nodded, then slowly approached the unlatched gate. It didn't creak. It didn't swing. It simply stood there, offering no resistance, no demand. The girl looked at Star, then turned to Jonas. "Can I come in?" Jonas didn't answer with words. Star did. He stepped forward and gently touched his nose to the girl's hand. That one gesture, soft, simple, was enough to undo something heavy. She burst into tears, not out of fear, but because, for the first time in months, she didn't feel like a burden. They told Jonas later how she'd survived a fire at a refugee camp, lost her parents, lost her voice. Since then, she'd been shuffled from place to place, each stop met with locked doors and hesitant stares. But not Star. Star didn't ask questions. Star didn't flinch. He just curled up beside her every night and breathed. Jonas understood that gentle touch at the gate wasn't just an invitation. It was a beginning. He set aside a small corner for her, close to the herb garden, where the morning sun reached first and the soil was soft, the kind of place roots could settle again. Each day, Star followed her to the garden. Sometimes he simply watched. Sometimes he pawed at the dirt. Sometimes he just lay by the daisies, eyes half closed, ears tuned to the world. From a distance, Jonas watched as her feet pressed gently into the soil, her hands planting tiny seeds as if rewriting a new language, one that didn't need words, just presence. One afternoon, as Jonas passed by, he saw her whispering something into Star's ear. No one else could hear it, but Star's tail gave a soft wag. Then he tilted his head, like he understood. That moment wasn't just a conversation between a child and a dog. It was a promise that from now on, neither of them would walk alone. And from that moment, Hope Ridge had one more vow stitched quietly into its soil. At twilight, with the sun casting a soft gold across the rooftops of Hope Ridge, Jonas sat on the front step, herbal tea in hand. It had been almost a week since Star had stepped out of the forest beside him to begin something Jonas had never dared name before. A home. And something had shifted since. Hope Ridge no longer felt like a place to hide broken things. It felt like a place where healing happened simply by being. Star rested to his left. The little girl sat to his right. No one spoke, but in that silence, it felt like all the broken pieces had finally found somewhere to rest. From the distance came the sound of footsteps, soft, steady, unhurried. A woman appeared, her silver hair tucked behind her shoulders, a fabric bag slung over one side. She walked straight up to Jonas and handed him a faded photocopy. "I think the girl could stay," she said softly, "but she'll need a guardian, and I can't think of anyone more fitting than you." Jonas looked at Star. Star didn't move, but his ears folded back. Then Jonas turned to the girl. "Do you want to stay?" She nodded. Then, for the first time, With a voice so small it nearly disappeared into the wind, she whispered, "I don't want to go anywhere else." That night, Hope Ridge didn't lock its gate, but this time the gate wasn't just left open to let someone in. It stood as a quiet truth that some wounds don't heal with medicine. They heal through presence. And Star, the quiet warrior, lay there still, eyes on the dirt road. Not to guard, but to welcome. That's when a journey ends, and a real home begins. Sometimes healing doesn't begin with words. It begins with presence, with one gentle touch, one look that says, "I remember, but I forgive." Jonas and Star's story reminds us that even in the deepest silence, where shame, suspicion, or betrayal once lived, redemption can still grow. Whether you're someone who's been accused without proof, or someone carrying guilt from a past you can't undo, know this: you are not alone. If you're living under the shadow of doubt or betrayal, take a breath. Before reacting, gather your truth. Protect your peace, and if you need to, speak up, not to prove yourself, but to free yourself. And if children are involved, protect their innocence. Let love, not revenge, guide your next move. Star didn't need to bark to prove his loyalty, and Jonas didn't need to run forever. In the end, truth stood its ground. Not through rage, but through quiet, unwavering care. Now it's your turn. Have you ever been blamed for something you didn't do? Or loved someone who doubted you? Share your story in the comments below. Let others see that behind every scar, there's a soul who kept walking forward. We're listening. You're safe here. And maybe, just maybe, your voice could be the hope someone else needs to hear today. Inside the aging community hall of Silver Creek, fluorescent lights dangled uneasily from a wooden ceiling scarred by time. Their pale yellow glow washed over the crowd like diluted sunlight, casting shadows across the anxious faces of the townspeople packed into every seat. On stage, under the weary hum of those lights, stood Max, a German shepherd, motionless in the spotlight. His fur shimmered, strands of deep gray and coal black catching the light like metal underwater. He did not bark. He did not whimper. He simply stood tall, head held high, like a soldier waiting for a command that would never come. In the third row, a tiny girl clung tightly to a chipped pink piggy bank. That was Lila Monroe, 7 years old. A faint swelling on her cheek still lingered, but she didn't flinch. Her eyes, wide and solemn, never left Max. The piggy bank cracked, faded, had been a birthday gift from her father, the last one she ever received from him. For 5 years, Lila had slipped coin after coin into its hollow belly. Her father, Officer Mark Monroe, had died during a high-risk investigation involving illegal chemicals. Since that day, Lila had not spoken a single word to anyone. Except Max. Adults called it selective mutism. Vivian, her mother, called it what it truly was, a wound rotting quietly from the inside out. Starting at $2,000. The auctioneer's voice cracked like a gavel striking the floorboards. $3,000! Shouted a man from the front row, paddle raised high. $4,000! Echoed another from the back. Vivian gripped her daughter's shoulders. Her arm trembled. Her hair was disheveled, her eyes bruised with exhaustion. A long, ugly bruise ran from her cheekbone to her ear, a souvenir from the night before. Dean, her current husband, hated when she cried about Max. Hated even more when Lila sat silent beside the dog, refusing to call him Dad. That mutt should have been sold off years ago, Dean had growled that morning, eyes never lifting from his phone. You keep him around, and she'll never grow up. Vivian hadn't answered. She had just pressed ice to her face and whispered to herself, Lila doesn't need to grow up. Lila just needs to survive. Up on stage, Max scanned the hall slowly. His eyes drifted across the rows until they met hers, Lila's. And then, his body stilled. His ears rose, his tail lowered, and a soft, almost inaudible whine escaped his throat. Only Lila could hear it. 7,000, someone shouted from across the room, cutting through the rising tension. Lila looked up. Her tiny heart pounded against her ribs. The numbers were climbing, drifting farther and farther from her reach. She lowered her head. Her fingers fumbled at the bottom of the piggy bank, prying open the rubber stopper. Coins clinked into her palm, a chaotic chorus of desperate hope. Her small hands, slick with sweat, trembled as she clutched every cent she had. Beside her, Vivian knelt down. Her eyes shimmered with tears. "You don't have to do this," she whispered, her voice barely holding together. "Sweetheart, you don't have to." But Lila shook her head. Her lips pressed tightly together. She didn't say a word. Only her hands were speaking, laying out the coins on her lap one by one, carefully counting them again. Like each coin was a promise, like each cent was holding together the last thread of something sacred. The auctioneer's gavel struck again. 10,000, 12,500, 15,000. Each bang landed like a blade across her chest, chipping away at what little hope she had left. Max was no longer. Still. His front paw crept forward, just a step. The handler jerked the leash hard, trying to keep him in place, but Max let out a low growl. Not loud, not angry. It was a warning, a quiet message that meant, "Do not hold me back." Inside Lila's heart, there was only one thought now. If Max were sold today, then everything she had left of her father would be gone too. Gone forever. Suddenly, a voice cut through the room. 20,000 from bidder number 12. Who will go higher? Lila froze. Her hands stopped. Her eyes widened. Had she misheard? Or had someone else just stepped into their story? Vivian turned too, looking towards the back of the room, where the lights faded into shadows. And there, in that dusky corner, stood a man, middle-aged, wearing an old leather jacket, gray streaks brushing his temples, one hand resting calmly on a bidding paddle, his face unreadable, cold and still, like the surface of a frozen lake. No one in the room knew who he was, but then he spoke. "I bid $60,000. The room fell silent. Completely. He didn't look like anyone else at the auction. No fancy watch, no pressed suit, no trace of excitement or performance. He just stood there, unmoving, like an old tree that had seen more than it cared to explain, and his eyes were locked on one thing. Lila. And Max. "Who is that?" someone whispered. A nervous voice answered, just barely above a breath. "David Quinn. Owns the Quinn Ranch north of town. Used to be federal. Vanished off the map after his daughter died in some strange accident." The air in the hall began to shift. It grew dense, like a storm cloud waiting to fall. Everyone was watching David now, but David didn't seem to care. His hand remained steady on the paddle. His eyes never left Lila. In the front row, Troy Haskins clenched his fists. He hadn't expected a challenger. Not here. Not now. He stood sharply, flinging his hair back, and lifted his paddle high. 70,000, he shouted, his voice oozing arrogance. Max growled again. The leash handler flinched, both hands braced as if holding back a storm. But Max didn't look at Troy. Max looked at Lila. Only Lila. And Lila. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. In that moment she was frozen. Her vision blurred. Tears hovered at the edge but never fell. Her arms still wrapped around that empty piggy bank, the one that used to be full of hopes. And finally, she bowed her head. Her shoulders began to tremble, just slightly, like something inside her was splintering, like the weight of silence had become too much to hold. Vivian saw her daughter like that, and couldn't hold it in anymore. She pulled Lila close, wrapping her arms tightly around her, pressing her face into the child's soft, smoky hair that still carried the scent of kitchen fires and long summer days. Tears traced a slow path down her bruised cheek, falling into her daughter's hair. One of her eyes was swollen nearly shut. But that pain was nothing compared to the ache of seeing her little girl so silent she couldn't even cry out loud. Vivian held Lila tighter. She didn't say a word. Just let out a long breath, one that carried years of helplessness. A breath soaked in everything she had buried since the day her husband died, and that new man walked through their door. That dog should be locked up. Dean had said it the night before, right after he kicked her in the ribs for looking at Max with sympathy in her eyes. Sell it, take the money, raise the girl from scratch. Vivian hadn't answered. But in her eyes, something had started to burn. A quiet fire, and it was growing. Up on the stage, the auctioneer paused. The air was thick, electric. Tension had curled itself around every breath in the room. 70,000 from the man in front. Do I hear more? 70. Going once. It felt like no one was breathing. 75. David's voice came low and distant, but carried weight like rolling thunder. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Every head turned. Troy gritted his teeth. He shot his hand up, ready to outbid again, but the man beside him leaned in quickly, his face tight with concern. "You don't want trouble with David Quinn," he whispered. "Word is he ran black operations, the kind of man you don't cross." Troy froze. His jaw clenched, his hand fell, but his eyes stayed locked forward, burning with resentment. The auctioneer looked around one last time. No hands rose, no voices called. $75,000 for Max, going once, going twice, sold. The sound of the gavel echoed like the final toll of a long-forgotten bell. Max jolted. He sprang to his feet, eyes searching the room. The leash handler tried to hold firm, but Max pulled loose, leaping from the stage into the sea of stunned faces. Max didn't run. He didn't panic. He walked, step by step, steady, intent. Down the aisle, straight toward the little girl who hadn't moved a muscle since he left her side. Lila rose slowly. Her legs trembled beneath her, but she stood. No one stopped her. No one dared. She stepped down 2 small steps. Her arms opened, and Max leaned into her chest, resting his head there like it was the only place that ever made sense. Every sound disappeared. The room held its breath. Vivian covered her mouth. She didn't sob out loud, but the grief, the release, the relief in her battered face, it cracked wide open like glass under heat. Then a sound, so quiet you might have thought you imagined it, a whisper, a single word floating up from a place long locked away. "Max," Lila had spoken, after 5 silent years. She said his name. "Max," Lila had spoken. After 5 long years of silence, that one name broke through the stillness like a sunrise through fog. In that moment, everyone in the room understood. This wasn't over. This was only the beginning. "No, don't sell Max. He's my friend." Her voice rose from the middle of the crowd, soft as a breeze but powerful enough to stop time. The one who shouted was Lila Monroe, the same little girl who hadn't uttered a single word since the day her father died. A pen clattered to the floor. A woman nearby gasped. "Oh my God!" Vivian spun toward her daughter, her eyes wide with disbelief. The arm that had been gently resting around Lila tightened instinctively. the bruise still lingering on her cheek, a cruel echo from the last time she said the wrong thing in front of her husband, seemed to fade beneath the flood of emotion that washed over her now. Because hearing Lila's voice again wasn't just a surprise, it was a miracle. Lila rose to her feet. She still held the broken piggy bank in her arms, just a few scattered coins and some carefully folded bills left inside. Her voice trembled, but her eyes burned with a determination far too strong for her small frame. "I want to bid," she said, each word carved out of her. "This is all the money I have, but Max isn't a thing." Next to her, Max didn't bark, didn't growl. He simply looked up at her, quiet and sure. He stepped forward. One gentle step, then another. And then, without hesitation, he sat down at her feet and rested his head against her knee, like he'd been waiting for this moment all along. Troy Haskins scoffed. A crooked, bitter smirk crept across his face. "Another little drama stunt?" he sneered. He leaned toward Vivian and lowered his voice just enough. "That dog should have been sold long ago." Vivian turned away, tears rushing to her eyes. It was not out of shame that she felt this way, but because the helplessness was breaking her heart. She had promised to protect her child, and she had failed. The auctioneer hesitated, awkward, stammering. "Ladies and gentlemen, the rules clearly state that children are not allowed to participate in bidding." "I don't need rules," Lila said, cutting him off. Her voice had changed, louder now, clearer. "I just need Max." Silence. Not a whisper, not a cough. There was no sound of breathing. "Max is the only friend I've ever had," she went on. "He's the last piece of my dad. The only reason I still want to wake up every morning." Then, without a word, she bent down, set the piggy bank on the floor, and with a soft, trembling motion, crack. She broke it. The ceramic split, and coins rolled across the hardwood. Each clink and spin felt like it carved through every adult heart in the room. And that's when David Quinn stepped forward from the shadows. No one tried to stop him. David walked slowly toward Lila. When he reached her, he knelt down, his gaze heavy with years but gentle. "I once lost a daughter," he said softly, "and I know. There are things money can never buy back, especially not in a place like this." Then he turned to the auctioneer, lifted his number plate, and spoke with calm finality. "My last offer, $80,000. The auctioneer's hand trembled on the gavel. $80,000. Do I hear more? Going once, going twice, sold." The crack of the gavel sounded like thunder, not because of its volume, but because the entire room had been holding its breath far too long. Vivian broke down. She rushed forward and wrapped her arms around her daughter, pulling Max into the embrace. Lila said nothing. She just rested her head on her mother's shoulder, her tears soaking into Vivian's hair. Max licked Lila's hand gently, then lifted his gaze to David. It wasn't a look of thanks or submission. It was deeper, steadier. As if Max understood completely that this was not the end. This was the beginning of something far bigger. Because as the doors of the auction hall slowly closed behind them, somewhere beyond that silence, the same forces that had taken Lila's father were still watching. And Max, along with the little girl he had never once failed to protect, was the final piece of a truth they had spent years trying to bury. The sun hadn't fully risen. A faint light filtered through the old window curtain, casting a soft golden stripe across the wooden floor, like a memory just beginning to surface. Lila sat beside Max, arms gently wrapped around his neck, her cheek resting on his shoulder. Nobody spoke. But in that stillness, the past began to unfold in quiet, vivid flashes, layer by layer, image by image, full of color and breath. She remembered the last morning her father had worn his deep green uniform. The kitchen had smelled like coffee. Max was chewing on a squeaky rubber ball between his paws, and Lila had been perched on the kitchen counter, legs swinging freely. "Lila, close your eyes," her dad had said, his voice warm and low, like wood knocking softly against faith. She shut them tightly, stifling a giggle, and waited. When she opened them, Max was sitting right in front of her, wearing a tiny baseball cap, his tail wagging wildly. "Max has an important mission today," her dad said. "To protect a princess." "Is it me?" she asked. He smiled. "Yeah. The princess's name is Lila." Max gave a quiet little bark, as if to say he understood his orders. Lila had laughed then, bright and full. That was the last time she heard her own laughter. That night, her father left the house with Max. No cap, no jokes, no whistles. Just one hurried sentence as he closed the door. "Keep Max close, Lila. If anything happens, you have to listen to him. Promise me." She nodded, too fast to ask, "Happens? What do you mean?" But Colton was already gone. Lila had nodded that night. She hadn't had the chance to ask, "What do you mean by something happening?" before Colton disappeared into the dark. That night stretched on forever, and the next morning, only Max came back, but not like before. Max didn't run. He didn't leap into her arms. He didn't wag his tail. He walked, slowly, painfully. Each step down the hallway dragged behind the last. His coat was soaked in blood. One leg dragged behind him, limp. And in his eyes, something broken, as if he'd seen the edge of a world no one should ever look into. Lila remembered sinking to the floor, knees on the carpet, hands trembling as she reached out and touched the wound along Max's side. But Max didn't cry. Max just licked her hand softly, slowly, and deliberately, like he was apologizing. Like he was trying to say, "Dad's not coming back." The grown-ups told her Colton had died in the line of duty. They said it was an accident during a pursuit. They said he was a hero. But no one ever said who he was chasing, or why it had to be that night, or how Max got hurt, or why everything needed to be kept quiet. And from that day on, Lila stopped speaking. Not out of anger, not even fear, but because there was no one left to listen. No one but Max. Now, as the early morning light spilled across Max's back, Lila ran her fingers gently down his spine over every scar, every memory. Max didn't move. He just leaned a little closer, his eyes barely open, as if dreaming of a quiet field somewhere, a place where Colton was still waiting. "Dad said, Max always finds what's been lost," Lila whispered. Max slowly lifted his head. No bark, no sudden shift. Just a soft nudge of his nose into the palm of her hand, a gesture so familiar, so old, it felt like childhood itself. Lila smiled, a small, quiet smile. And he was right. The house had gone still, but the night had not. In the dim kitchen, Dean Monroe sat rigid in a wooden chair by the back door, as if he could feel eyes watching through the walls. His knee bounced faintly. The warm glow from the overhead light cast long shadows across his face, revealing a sheen of unease. Outside, the wind slipped through the old fence, creaking with every gust, each sound like a knock at the door of something he couldn't name. Then the phone in his hand buzzed. No number showed. Dean glanced toward the stairs, where Vivian and Lila were sleeping. He answered, his voice low and steady. "Hello?" A man's voice came through, calm and clear, with no need for introductions. "I'm not calling to ask for permission. I'm calling to remind you. Time's almost up. That dog needs to disappear from this town." Dean didn't answer. His throat tightened. He stared down at his hand, the bruise still faint from the last time he'd tried to discipline Max. but it wasn't from a bite. Max hadn't laid a paw on him. It was the look Max gave him. That same look Colton used to give. A look that had haunted Dean's sleep every night since. The voice on the other end pressed on. "We paid you to do your part. Remember, Vivian and the girl, they're both fragile." Cold. So cold it shattered the fragile warmth that had barely begun to settle after the auction. Dean hung up. He slammed the phone on the table and reached for a bottle of whiskey, pouring himself a glass. The burn down his throat was sharp enough to make him feel alive again, if only for a second. Moments later, soft footsteps came down the stairs. "You're still up?" Vivian's voice came gently from behind him. Dean turned quickly, masking the flicker of panic with a stiff smile. "Just thinking, that's all." Vivian stepped closer, her long hair draped down her shoulder, catching the faint kitchen light. There was still a fading bruise on her cheek, a ghost of an old rage, but her eyes held no fear now, just the heavy, lingering weight of exhaustion. "Lila didn't eat tonight," Vivian murmured. "She sat with Max all afternoon, didn't say a word. But the way she looked at him..." Her voice caught. She rested her hand on the table, grounding herself. "Dean, if there's something going on, if anything you've done might hurt Lila, I need to know." Dean froze. For a moment, just one flickering moment, he wanted to spill everything. To tell her about the man who'd approached him before the auction. James Hammond. To confess that Hammond wanted Max gone, not sold. Because that dog had seen something. Knew something Hammond needed buried. To admit that he, Dean Monroe, had taken the money. Had promised to convince Vivian to give Max up. But instead of truth, Dean gave her silence. A shake of the head. "I'm just tired." Vivian studied him for a long moment. Her eyes said she didn't believe him. But she said nothing. She turned and walked away, quietly. That night, Dean stepped outside into the backyard. He lit a cigarette and leaned against the warped wooden wall, watching the smoke curl toward the stars. Max lay curled up next to Lila under the porch roof, his head resting on her legs. No sound, no growl, no bark. But when Dean stepped down onto the grass, Max's eyes opened. It wasn't a threatening stare like people often feared from working dogs. It was just a stare, steady, unblinking, not angry, not afraid. Dean took a long breath and looked down at Max. "You think I'm the villain in this story, don't you?" Max didn't move, but one ear tilted slightly, as if listening with something deeper than instinct. Dean stepped closer, now barely a meter away from the dog. "But I'm just a man trying to be a father. I don't want Lila growing up stuck in a dream that isn't real. I want her to move on from Colton's shadow. I want her to have a normal life." Max said nothing, but his eyes never left Dean's. "Am I wrong?" Dean's voice dropped to a whisper, like a confession he hadn't even meant to say out loud. A breeze rolled through the yard, rustling the wild grass. Max exhaled slowly, not a growl, not a whimper, just a long, quiet breath. Human, almost. Like forgiveness, or maybe just understanding. Dean turned away and dropped the cigarette to the dirt. And in that silence, something stirred inside him. Not fear of Hammond, but fear of something far more fragile. Fear of losing the one thing he had never dared to hope for. A chance at redemption. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the cream-colored curtains and painted soft golden stripes across the weathered wooden floor. In the corner of the small bedroom, Lila sat curled against the wall, knees drawn tightly to her chest, hair tousled from a sleepless night. Max was right beside her, eyes closed, but ears on alert, twitching gently in rhythm with the weight of her breathing. The silence wasn't empty. It wasn't awkward. It had shape, it had memory, it had meaning only Max and Lila could understand. It had been 5 years since Lila last spoke. 5 long years since she uttered her final word. And Max had been the only one there to hear it. Maybe that's why anyone trying to separate them wasn't just threatening a bond, they were threatening the fragile shell of existence Lila was still clinging to. That morning, the sun brushed across Lila's tangled hair like strands of pale gold. She didn't move. Max stayed pressed against her side, his warm body curled to fit the small curve of hers at the edge of the bed. No alarm clock. No voice calling from the hallway. Just the soft rhythm of a guardian's breath and the gaze of a creature who had never once turned away. Lila knew her mother was worried. She knew Dean, who she refused to call Dad, was hiding something too. But Lila didn't ask. She didn't speak. She never spoke to anyone. Except Max. Vivian opened the door quietly, holding a warm cup of milk in her hands. But when her eyes fell on her daughter's familiar, curled-up shape, her heart ached all over again. "Oh, honey," Vivian whispered as she placed the warm cup of milk on the bedside table. She didn't expect a response. Instead, she sat down beside the bed, gently smoothing Lila's tangled hair, then reached out and rested her hand softly on Max's head. Her eyes shimmered with tears. Max opened his eyes, met Vivian's gaze for a long, quiet moment, then turned his head to look at Lila. No one spoke, but something inside Lila stirred, something deep and burning. It wasn't fear, it wasn't sadness, it was anger. Quiet, shapeless, unspoken anger. Anger that no one believed her. Anger that everyone kept saying if Max was gone, things would somehow be normal again. But to Lila, Max wasn't a memory. Max was now. Max was the last living language she had left since the day her world caved in. That afternoon, Lila sat out on the back steps of the house. Max followed, lying down beside her feet without needing to be called, without a command. Like always. In her hands, Lila held an old notebook, corners bent and peeling. The first page had a photo of Colton Monroe, her father, in uniform. Behind it was Max's paw print, pressed into a piece of white paper, laminated with care. Below it, scrawled in faint pencil, were the words she once wrote. Family. She flipped to a fresh page. No drawings, just a few shaky lines, the first written words in months. "If people can't hear me, can dogs?" Max raised his head and nudged her knee gently. Then he rested it back down. Lila sighed. No one had ever taught her how to use words to fight lies. No one showed her how to scream when what she needed most was someone to understand her without a sound. But Max never needed teaching. That night, Dean walked into the living room where Lila sat. He cleared his throat. "Tomorrow there's a meeting at the community center. They're going to decide what to do about Max." Lila didn't move. Dean stepped closer, holding an envelope. "Maybe it's time you learned how to let go." Max rose to his feet and stepped in front of Lila, blocking Dean's path. His stance was calm but firm. Dean stopped, his face darkened. "Lila, you have to understand. You can't keep Max forever." She looked at him. No tears, no anger, just an empty gaze. Then, slowly, she opened the notebook on her lap and turned to the last page. Dean leaned in. There was a drawing. A little girl stood in the middle of a rainstorm, gripping the neck of a large German shepherd. All around her, faceless people in suits loomed, holding leashes in their hands. At the bottom of the page, beneath the sketch, Lila had written, "It's not that I don't speak. It's that no one ever listens." Dean stumbled back a step, as if something invisible had pushed him. His face lost color. From the kitchen doorway, Vivian froze at the sight of them. Lila was sitting cross-legged. Max was resting his chin on her leg, and Dean was silent, stunned, and unsure where he stood anymore. No one needed to say anything. Max leaned closer, nudging his face into Lila's lap once more. That night, when all the lights in the house had gone dark, Vivian stayed out on the back porch long after the others had fallen asleep. She watched her daughter curled up with Max, both of them breathing in rhythm, as if one heart beat for two souls. Above the sound of crickets and the hush of wind brushing through the trees, Vivian whispered to the night, almost like a confession. "She doesn't need words. Not if Max is still here." Afternoons in the western hills of Silver Creek had a silence all their own. No car horns, no street vendors shouting over speakers, just the wind threading through old pine trees and the soft creak of a rusted windmill blade turning somewhere in the distance. David Quinn often said this was a place to forget, or to remember. Years ago, he chose to forget. Since the day he lost Jessica, his only daughter, David had locked himself away on a quiet farm at the edge of town. He spent his days tending to old horses, trimming weeds, and rereading yesterday's newspapers. Once, they called him a top state investigator. Once, they called his daughter a fearless engineer who exposed a pharmaceutical scandal. Now they called him nothing. Just a quiet man with eyes that always seemed to be listening to ghosts. He had once sworn off everything, tossed his case files into the back of a rotting drawer, swallowed sleeping pills so he wouldn't see her in his dreams anymore, her voice trembling, the bruises on her neck dismissed as workplace injury in the autopsy. But one afternoon, driving past the Silver Creek Community Center on his way to pick up feed, David slowed when he saw a crowd outside. He didn't know why he parked, didn't know why he got out of the truck. From the edge of the sidewalk, he heard the loudspeaker announce, "Next up, K9 Max, 7 years old, retired. Trained in chemical detection, formerly assigned to a cross-state narcotics investigation." David's chest tightened. On the stage stood Max, a German shepherd, body tense, ears high, chained by a handler. Max wasn't looking at the audience. Max was scanning the crowd, searching. David's breath caught. He knew this dog, not directly, but through letters, through voice memos Jessica used to send, the ones he deleted, the ones he burned. "Dad, I'm working with this incredible dog named Max. He's got this instinct for chemicals Meridian's trying to move quietly. If something ever happens to me, you have to find Max." Those words, those warnings, he had dismissed them all. And now, here Max was, and just below the stage, David saw a little girl clutching a chipped pink piggy bank, eyes shimmering with tears. He turned to someone beside him and asked, his voice low and rough, "Who's that girl?" "Lila Monroe. Her father was an officer who died during an operation. Max was his partner. Word is the girl hasn't spoken to anyone since he passed. No one but Max." David turned away. On the drive home, the wind lashed against the sides of the pickup like it was trying to rip open scars long scabbed over. He didn't say a word. But that night, David sat alone in the old storage shed, the one where he'd buried all his past, and began pulling out the dusty case files. His hands trembled as he opened them, page by page, like peeling back pieces of himself. He hadn't been able to save Jessica, but maybe, just maybe, he could save what she left behind. A few days later, David quietly reached out to the auction committee. He used a name they hadn't heard in years. David Quinn. Most people thought he showed up at the auction out of pride, maybe to flex his wealth, or just another eccentric old man craving attention. But no one knew the truth. David hadn't come to bid on a dog. He'd come to buy back the last living piece of his daughter's truth. Max wasn't just Lila's dog. Max was the final link in the investigation Jessica died trying to finish. And if Max ever fell into the hands of James Hammond, the new director of Meridian, everything would be wiped clean. David knew that. Hammond knew it too, and maybe, just maybe, Max knew as well. That night, sleep never came. Snow began to fall in fine, whispering threads outside his window. And in David's mind, Max sat calmly in the shadows of the storage shed, beside a stack of unopened evidence files that had never seen the light of justice. As usual, the late afternoon brought a gentle hush to the western hills of Silver Creek. The sky glowed gold as sunlight sifted through thinning clouds, brushing across the tall grass like a slow hand. Leaves shivered in the breeze. And beneath the broad shadow of an old maple, David waited, his fingers wrapped around a mug of steaming coffee, eyes fixed on the dirt road where Vivian's car had just come to a stop. Vivian stepped out slowly. She looked thinner than he remembered. Her cheek still bore the fading bruise from Dean's latest outburst, but this time, she didn't lower her head. She wasn't the same woman who once endured in silence. Today, Vivian moved like a mother with nothing left to lose. David stood, straightened his coat, and extended his hand gently. "Thank you for coming," he said, voice low and cautious, like someone speaking while balancing on the edge between truth and heartbreak. They sat across from each other at a weathered wooden table beneath the tree. Silence hung between them, heavy and respectful. No one dared break it too soon. "Were you really a federal investigator?" Vivian asked finally, her eyes narrowing, testing the ground beneath her feet. David nodded once. "I was a father first. Jessica, my daughter, she worked in Meridian's research division. 3 weeks after she filed a whistleblower complaint, she died in a car crash. No investigation, no answers." Vivian swallowed hard. "I'm so sorry." David didn't respond right away. Instead, he quietly reached into his coat and pulled out a thin file folder. He set it gently on the table between them. "Jessica left these notes behind," he said softly. "Max was on Colton's K-9 team back then. He once picked up traces of an illegal chemical compound during a patrol. We believe that was the turning point." Vivian froze. The name of her husband, Colton, opened a flood of memories she had tried to lock away. The blood-stained uniform, the final message. The funeral was without ceremony or music. And now that name was back, not as closure, but as a missing link between two deaths still buried in silence. David lowered his voice. "I know Max is the last piece connecting Lila to her father, but Max is also the last clue that connects me to my daughter." Vivian clenched her hands. The wind picked up, rustling dry leaves across the stone path like whispers of unfinished stories. "So, the reason you bought Max was for the case?" Her voice trembled at the edges. David didn't answer right away. He raised his eyes to meet hers, tired, haunted eyes that still held a flicker of something raw and human. "I told the board I came for Lila," he said slowly. "But the truth is, I've been following Max for a long time. For justice, for Jessica. But when I saw that little girl wrap her arms around Max that day, I realized some things aren't just about the truth. They're about compassion." Vivian let out a breath, shaky and uneven. Her eyes welled, not just because of David's words, but because of what they stirred in her. For a split second she could see Colton again, sitting on the porch steps, resting a hand on Max's head, smiling as he said that if anything ever happened to him, Max would speak in his place. Vivian never believed it. What dog could carry the weight of a fallen soldier's voice? But Max had done just that, not through barking or howling, but through gentle nudges, through a gaze that never judged, through presence. Lila hadn't spoken a word since Colton died. Vivian had screamed at her in the dark, begged her to say something, anything. She'd cried herself empty when the doctors said there was nothing physically wrong, that it was all emotional trauma. And now, as David said aloud, what Vivian had only dared whisper in her grief, that Max was the final thread tying a little girl to the father she'd lost, the tears returned, unstoppable. David said nothing more. But beneath the silence, something old began to stir inside him. He'd told himself he came for Lila, but that wasn't the whole truth. He'd come for Max, for the notes Jessica left behind, for the questions that still clawed at the back of his mind, for the scream he'd buried in the snow 2 winters ago. But when he looked into Vivian's tearful eyes, David finally understood pain has no face. Losing a husband or losing a daughter, whether it's a piece of your flesh or a familiar voice you'll never hear again, it's all the same kind of wound, a tear in the soul that never quite closes. And in that moment, he knew. They weren't just 2 strangers drawn to Max by coincidence. They were survivors, both bearing scars that only those who've lost something irreplaceable can recognize in silence. Max had once been Jessica's voice. Now Max was the final echo of Colton's, and maybe if there was anything in this world still worth trusting, it was the quiet, 4-legged creatures who spoke for the ones we've lost in ways we're too afraid to. There are nights that don't begin with darkness. They begin with fear. And sometimes that fear doesn't come from the world outside. It comes from a door inside your own house. A door that used to feel safe. A door now trembling under the weight of something broken, something violent. The front door slammed open with a violent kick that made the walls shudder. It wasn't the wind. It was Dean. Once he'd shared a bed with Vivian. Once he'd whispered vows before a priest, swearing love and protection. But tonight, he was just a drunken man, teetering on the edge, soaked in whiskey and carrying rot behind his eyes. His coat hung half off his shoulder, his shoes dragged mud across, the tile floor. Smoke clung to him, thick and stale like something dead. Vivian didn't need to look. She already knew. The storm wasn't coming from the sky. It was already here, under her roof. Still up? Dean's voice was slurred, thick as mud. He stood in the kitchen, the glow from the fridge light casting a pale stripe across the side of Vivian's bruised face. She didn't answer. Her hand stayed wrapped around a cold cup of tea, her eyes locked on the door to Lila's room, the door behind which her daughter was sleeping, curled up with Max. "You gonna let that girl grow up clinging to that damn dog?" Dean muttered, taking a staggering step forward. "What's she even going to become like that?" Vivian rose from her chair. "Lila spoke tonight, for the first time in 5 years, and it was because of Max." Dean scoffed. "You're insane. It's a dog. You and this whole damn house are dog-cursed or something." Vivian turned to him, her eyes cold, sharp as broken glass. "If I have to choose between a dog that protects and a man who only knows how to destroy, I'll keep the dog." Dean's eyes widened. "What did you just say?" "You heard me." The air crackled between them, his hand clenched tighter around the beer can, stepping closer, lips curled into a snarl. But he froze when he saw her hand reach into the kitchen drawer. She didn't pull out a knife. She pulled out alder that was thick, weathered, and heavy with time. "This," she said, sliding it toward him across the table, "is what a real father leaves behind for his child." Dean snatched it up, flipped through the pages of photographs, signatures, and notes, and then slammed it to the floor like it burned him. "I don't care about this crap. You just can't stop digging through the past, dragging trash into this house to make yourself feel noble." Vivian knelt, picking up each page, each picture, each crumpled scrap. Her fingers smoothed every corner gently, like she was burying the last of her forgiveness one piece at a time. "And if you say one more word," she said, rising slowly, her voice cold and steady, "about my daughter, about Max, or about Colton." She stared straight at him, unmoving. "Then I swear you won't even be worthy of breathing under this roof again." There are people in this world who vanish from the system before the system can swallow them whole. Carl Redden was one of them. David Callahan parked his truck in front of a crumbling watch shop tucked beneath the southern ridge of Silver Ridge. The windows were fogged with dust. 2 letters had long since fallen from the sign. Inside, a single dim yellow bulb hung from the ceiling, casting its tired glow on a pair of wrinkled hands carefully opening the back of an old military watch. Carl Redden didn't look up when David walked in. He didn't need to. That silhouette wasn't just some customer coming in for a battery change. Without lifting his eyes from the tiny gears, Carl asked quietly, "Who are you?" David reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small metal badge. It was worn, edges dulled with time, but the raised logo of the K9 training unit was still visible. "This belonged to my son, Colton Callahan." Carl froze, just for a second. Then he turned, reached beneath the counter, and pulled out a faded fabric pouch. Inside were sheets of old photocopies, the ink barely legible in places. David took one and held it up. In the corner, Carl's signature. "The last time Max was formally evaluated, you signed off," David said. Carl didn't respond right away. He removed the magnifying lens from his forehead and set it aside. His clouded eyes stared at David for a long moment. Then, like a weight finally collapsing onto his chest, Carl exhaled and shook his head. "I didn't have the authority to say no," he said softly. Back then, Max had just flagged a chemical trace linked to Meridian. We didn't know Colton was following the same scent trail. His voice cracked, dropping to a fragile whisper. "They forced me to sedate Max, called it a scent threshold reset protocol. Truth is, they were scrubbing his memory." Carl's hands trembled. "After that, Max was transferred. No one said where, but I was the last one to see him walk out of the center. And you know what? He didn't resist. He just looked at me. And kept looking." The air inside the shop felt heavy, like it had been filled with lead. David stood in silence. Max, behind him, didn't bark, didn't move forward. He simply watched, eyes focused on the old man gasping through invisible grief. Carl opened the lowest drawer and pulled out a military green USB drive, wrapped carefully in an old plastic pouch. He placed it in David's hand. "This is all I kept. Scent pattern logs, training footage they wiped from the servers. I don't know if you've got what it takes to go up against the people behind this, but whatever happens, don't let Max disappear again." David nodded and gripped Carl's hand. A thank you passed through skin, not words. As David turned to leave, Max remained where he was. Then, after a quiet beat, Max walked forward. No growl, no bite. He simply touched his nose to the back of Carl's hand, gently, like forgiving something that time alone couldn't erase. Carl lowered his head. His hand rested on Max's head. His eyes closed. A single tear rolled down his weathered cheek and dropped onto the glass face of the dusty watch he never had time to clean. Some truths never make it into the files. They live in what others tried so hard to erase. The wooden kitchen of the house by the woods had always been the warmest place in the home. But that afternoon, the breeze slipping through the cracks in the door made the soft yellow glow from the hanging lamp feel dim and fragile. David Callahan sat down at the table and plugged the USB Carl had given him into his battered old laptop. Behind him, Vivian stood with her arms crossed, her eyes a swirl of uncertainty. Lila crouched near the table, her hand resting gently on Max's head. Max didn't move, but his ears stood up, tuned to something deeper than sound. Click. A single folder popped up. Operation Meridian Eyes Only. No one spoke. No one breathed. The first video started to play. The footage was shaky, dimly lit, and obviously recorded in a rush on a personal device. Colton's voice crackled through the wind hitting the microphone, each word broken and raw. I suspect there's something off about today's training protocol. Max is reacting to a scent that's not in the approved database. David's fingers clenched tighter around the chair. His breathing thickened. Vivian gripped the edge of the counter. Max stayed still, stone still. No one at the center is responding to my request for an inspection. Colton's voice continued. I secretly took a sample off Max's coat, sent it to a private lab. They confirmed it's a phosphorus-based compound, unregistered and unapproved. The video cut to a different clip, a gray-tiled corridor. The camera caught Colton, silent and focused, placing a sealed envelope into a mailbox. A subtitle slid across the screen. Meridian Sample Top Confidential. Vivian exhaled, a long, aching breath, but didn't move. Then came another clip. An internal briefing marked Meridian Internal Briefing Top Secret. 10 figures sat inside a conference room. They intentionally blurred most of their faces. The exception was James Hammond. James Hammond. Wearing a black uniform and a senior badge on his chest, Hammond leaned forward and signed a document. The footage froze at the precise moment the tip of his pen touched the title line. Authorization for Reflex Erasure Drug K, 9 number 314. Max was K9 number 314. Vivian collapsed into a chair, stunned. Her eyes were wide and empty, and she was unable to form a single word. David slammed the laptop shut, his arm trembling. No one moved. The kitchen, once a sanctuary, now held the weight of every silence that had ever mattered. Beneath the table, Lila still hadn't said a word. But Max stood up, slowly and silently walked over to her, and placed his head gently on her lap. No growl, no bark, just presence, as if to say, now you understand why. Vivian rose from her chair and walked over to the sink. She poured herself a glass of water, but when she turned around, her eyes no longer shimmered with tears. There was something else now, a quiet resolve, cold and clear. We can't keep this buried in the dark. David didn't respond right away. His eyes lingered on a scratch across the wooden table, right where Colton had carved the word stand with his pocket knife when he was just 14. Finally, he gave a small nod. We have to move carefully. One wrong step, and Max will be the first one they come for. Vivian's grip on the glass tightened. Lila stepped forward, standing between her mother and David. Her small hand rested on Max's head, like a vow that didn't need words. David reached down to gently run a hand over Lila's hair, then turned and walked out onto the porch. The wind drifting in from the pine forest carried with it the scent of damp earth and wild grass. Colton's story, once scattered like lost fragments, was now beginning to form a sharper picture. A conspiracy. A command to inject. A dog who'd been erased, but who remembered. From the corner of the room, Max lifted his head. There was a rare flicker in his brown eyes. Max had never forgotten. There are places that aren't homes, just the places you're dragged back to by the people who once tried to forget you. That morning, Vivian opened the front door and froze. A thick envelope was sitting squarely on the porch step. No one had delivered it. No postage. Just a deep red seal stamped across crisp white paper. Southridge K9 Training Center. Inside was a recall notice for Max. The reason? Standard post-deployment medical evaluation. Vivian frowned. David read only the first few lines before setting the letter down with a weighted voice. This isn't a checkup. This is their last legal play to take Max out. The air inside the house thickened like fog rolling in before a storm. Everyone understood. If they ignored the order, the family could be charged with unlawfully harboring an active duty K-9. But if they complied, it might be the last time they ever saw Max come back whole. Vivian paced the kitchen, wringing her hands. There's got to be a way to stall this. Some regulation, some clause we can use. David shook his head slowly. They wrote the rules, and they know how to bend every one of them. At the end of the hallway, Lila sat quietly beside Max. She leaned her forehead against his, her eyes sunken with something deeper than fear. Then her voice rose soft, almost a whisper, but clear enough to stop everyone in their tracks. Max isn't afraid, so we don't get to be either. The next morning, they brought Max back to Southridge. The heavy metal gates creaked open like jaws ready to swallow every memory whole. Max stepped forward slowly, but halfway down the corridor, he stopped. His whole body tensed. A low growl rumbled from his throat, not a bark, not a warning, a reflex of survival. A young technician in a white coat approached, holding a silver syringe in his hand. He crouched beside Max, muttering as he prepared to inject it into the back of Max's neck. It's just a routine checkup shot. David stepped forward, his voice like ice. I want to see that vial. You don't have authority here. That's my son's dog. I have every right. The air tightened around them like a noose. But before the argument could escalate, Max sprang to life, his body twisted with instinct, and in one sudden move, he lunged at the technician's arm. Snap! The syringe flew to the floor. The thin glass cracked, spilling pale blue liquid that bubbled and hissed like acid. The tile where it landed immediately darkened, corroding right before their eyes. For a moment, no one moved. The silence felt lethal. David's voice exploded down the hallway. This isn't medical. Who ordered this? Who signed off on this? Vivian rushed to Max's side, wrapping her arms around him. A security guard tried to hold her back, but Lila had already raised her phone. Her hands didn't shake. She hit record. That afternoon, the footage went live. Within 8 hours, it had over 3 million views. The comment section burned with outrage. What kind of drug eats through tile? This isn't a checkup. This is an execution. Is Max a retired service dog or a witness they want to silence? Overnight, Max went from forgotten K-9 to national outcry. No one called him just a dog anymore. People understood. Max carried fragments of truth in his bones, pieces of a fallen soldier who died chasing something bigger than himself. And now Max wasn't just a dog on borrowed time, he was a living witness that the system couldn't erase. As the video spread, Southridge Training Center went into full PR crisis mode. Press conferences, public statements, and internal investigations ensued. Some called it a mistake, others weren't so sure. The questions grew sharper, the silence from authorities grew louder. Then came an anonymous email. It landed in Vivian's inbox in the middle of the night. No subject line, no sender name, just a single line of text. This is what they don't want you to see. Vivian hesitated before clicking play. The video began with shaky footage, the lighting dim and flickering, but just clear enough to reveal the inside of an old training room at Southridge. Max was strapped tightly to a steel frame. His eyes were wide open, ears alert, every muscle locked in fear. 3 men in white lab coats surrounded the frame. A gruff, clipped voice echoed through the hum of a ventilation fan. One of them, clearly James Hammond, pointed to a dark-colored vial on a metal tray. Stronger dose. This one's special. We need to be sure it doesn't react to any scent markers tied to Meridian. David jolted upright. Vivian held her breath. The entire room went still. One of the technicians stepped toward Max, syringe in hand. Max growled, low and furious. The sound boomed through the ceiling speakers like a thunderclap. Then, with a sudden twist, Max bit through the strap at his paw. One leg broke free. His knee scraped violently against the steel frame, claws screeching. The syringe hit the floor. The vial shattered. The liquid splashed out, bubbling and hissing, eating through the tile beneath. A jagged black burn mark spread beneath Max's feet. Hammond turned to the ceiling camera and snapped, "Cut the surveillance feed." None of this gets recorded. The clip cut to black. The room was silent, except for the wind whistling past the windows. David rose to his feet, his eyes locked on the screen. He opened a drawer, pulled out 3 external hard drives, and plugged them in one by one. "We can't lose this footage, not again." Vivian gripped her hands together tightly, her eyes moving from David to Max, who had quietly stepped up to the screen. Max touched his nose to the frozen image of himself on the monitor, the version of him that had been tied down, silenced, and tortured. But Max didn't growl, didn't bark. Max turned, walked over to Lila, and gently rested his chin on her leg. Lila, who had been still and silent through it all, didn't look away. Vivian placed her hand on her daughter's shoulder. Her voice cracked with quiet fury and years of buried grief. "They're not just trying to erase Max. They're trying to erase everything he remembers, everything Colton died for." David plugged in the final drive. Each file transfer felt like a heartbeat, each click a defiance. Memory by memory, justice that had been buried was now being preserved. Outside, the headlights of an unmarked SUV flared through the window. It stopped 3 houses down, no license plates. But no one flinched, not Vivian, not David, not Max. Lila leaned in close and whispered to Max. Her voice was low but steady. "They think Max is just a dog, but Max knows the truth, and this time I won't let anyone take him away." Max didn't move. He didn't need to. That night, in a small house tucked away on the edge of town, a dog once labeled retired had become a living witness to a crime no one dared to name. And for the first time, justice had teeth. The family was no longer just a victim. They were now the keepers of a truth powerful enough to shake an entire system. Vivian was making tea in the kitchen when a knock echoed through the house. 3 knocks. Sharp. Even. Not rushed, not hesitant. The kind of knock from someone who knew exactly why they were there. She paused, tilting her head towards the sound. David looked up from the study, his gaze tightening. In the living room, Max lifted his head, ears erect, eyes locked onto the front door with unwavering focus. "Did you hear that?" Vivian whispered, her hand gripping the kettle handle a little too tightly. David nodded. "I'll check." He stepped to the door and opened it. A man in a white coat stood on the porch, the collar embroidered with the old Southridge Training Center logo. In his hand was a black case. "I've been ordered to collect a K9 blood sample for post-litigation health reassessment," the man said briskly, his tone flat, rehearsed. Vivian frowned. "Reassessment? We haven't received any notice." "Internal directive," the man replied. "Needs to be completed today under Clause 6.4. Sudden inspection rights for K9S not officially retired." Max rose from where he lay beside Lila. He didn't bark, but he growled a low, steady sound rumbling from deep in his chest. A sound that meant one thing: danger. The man flinched slightly, tightening his grip on the case. David tilted his head, his eyes narrowing at the bulge under the sleeve of the man's coat. Something was tucked inside. "Open the case," David said, his voice calm but firm. "Sorry, medical materials. Only technicians are allowed." To handle David didn't wait. One hand grabbed the man's wrist while the other yanked open his coat pocket. A glass vial fell to the porch, the cap snapping off. The label shimmered under the light, the print smudged but still legible. Canine Inert Protocol. The air froze. Vivian's breath caught. That was banned 8 years ago. Exactly, David said quietly. The same drug that wiped an entire canine unit's reflexes and memory, right before they were euthanized. The man tried to pull away. Max growled louder now, stepping in front of Vivian and Lila. His teeth bared, muscles coiled. There was no mistaking it. This was a final warning. "Call the police," David said quickly, his eyes never leaving the man in white. The man screamed. "You don't understand! I was just following orders." "Whose orders?" David snapped, his voice like a blade. "The Center's. They're afraid Max will remember the Meridian scent and bring the whole network down." During the struggle, a neighbor across the street had been filming everything. The video showed Max growling, David pulling open the technician's lab coat, and a vial crashing onto the wooden porch. It showed a man, posing as a medical staffer, confessing to drugging a retired K9. By that afternoon, the footage was everywhere. That night, the family sat together in silence. News channels replayed the video over and over. There, on every screen, was Max. Not as a tool, not as a weapon, but as a living witness. The only being who still remembered the truth and who was now being hunted for it. Vivian rested her hand gently on Max's back and whispered, "They want to silence you, Max. But this time, we won't stay quiet." The parking lot behind the Silver Creek strip mall was deserted. Dusk had settled. Pale yellow lights stretched Max's shadow across the rain-damp concrete. Vivian had just popped the trunk, stacking boxes of Meridian files, when David stiffened beside her. "Someone's coming." They turned as one. A man in a black jacket and hood was heading toward them, quickly, from behind a rusted pickup. He didn't look around. No greeting. His eyes locked onto Vivian like a targeting system. Max let out a low growl. It rolled from his chest like thunder before a storm. Lila, clutching a folder of documents, instinctively stepped backward toward the car. The man kept approaching. One hand slid into his coat pocket. David moved forward, placing himself between the stranger and his family. "What do you want?" His voice was calm, but edged in steel. There was no answer. The man's hand emerged fast, holding something small and metallic. Not a gun, not quite a knife either. It was a compressed gas injector, the same kind used in reported K9 poisonings. Max lunged before David could even shout. The attack was lightning. The man flinched, stumbling back, raising the device toward Max. Crack! David kicked the man's wrist hard. The device flew across the wet concrete, clanged against the bumper, and spun back toward them. But Max didn't stop. Max closed in, body low to the ground, eyes fixed on the attacker like a laser scope. The man cursed and fumbled at his belt, pulling out a small glass vial filled with a dark brown liquid. "Max, stop!" Vivian shouted. Max froze mid-growl, backing up just a half step, just enough to give David the opening. The vial shattered. A bitter, acrid stench filled the air instantly, a chemical cocktail meant to burn and erase. David stumbled back, coughing hard, hand over his mouth. Vivian didn't hesitate. She whipped out her phone and went live, pointing the camera, straight at the man's face as he frantically dug through his jacket for something else. "Police are on their way," she said firmly. "Do you realize this is a federal offense? You're trying to poison a retired service animal." The man stammered. But Max didn't give him time to finish. With one last, powerful leap, Max latched onto the man's wrist. He didn't sink his teeth in deep, just enough to bring him down and pin him flat against the pavement like a trained officer holding down a suspect. David kicked away the remaining weapon. Vivian dropped beside Max, grabbing hold of the worn leather collar. "Max, good boy. Let go." Max was released, but didn't move. Just stood there, panting, chest heaving, never breaking eye contact with the stranger on the ground. Sirens screamed in the distance. Local police and security guards from the nearby mall poured into the lot. Within seconds, the man was cuffed and hauled away. His face was pale, and his wrist was bloodied. A female officer approached. "Mrs. Vivian, we'll need to pull footage from the lot. Do you have anything we can use?" Vivian nodded. "Southwest corner cameras got full coverage. I want the unedited footage. It'll show Max detecting the threat and that man pulling a banned chemical compound." The officer looked toward Max, who was now lying beside Lila, his head resting on her lap, his eyes still alert. A quiet smile crept across the woman's face. "I used to train canines," she said softly. "That dog knows exactly what he's doing." David nodded, his voice low but firm. "Max doesn't just remember with his brain. Max remembers with his heart." Vivian tightened her grip around her daughter, her voice thick with emotion. "But the system, it wants to erase that memory." The police cruiser disappeared into the darkness. Inside it, the attacker kept glancing back toward Max, as if he still couldn't believe a dog had unraveled an entire conspiracy. Max let out a quiet whine. Not from pain, but from something deeper, from knowing the fight wasn't over. In the back seat, Max lay on his side, his back pressed gently against the floor mat. His front leg was wrapped in a soft bandage after that rough scuffle in the parking lot. But it wasn't the injury keeping Max awake. Lila sat curled beside him, one hand slowly stroking his back. Max rested his heavy head in her lap, warm, solid, and constant. His ears twitched occasionally at the sound of wind slipping through the window seams, or Vivian whispering something to David in the front seat. "Do you think Max is okay?" Lila asked softly. David glanced at the rearview mirror. "Max is okay. He's just remembering." Lila didn't answer. Her hand kept moving, not to soothe Max, but to steady herself. Because she knew the real fear isn't what you can see. It's what you feel and can't explain. That night, no one in the house truly slept. The evidence they'd collected, from the parking lot footage to the officer's testimony to the vial of banned chemicals, was copied and backed up in multiple places. David sent encrypted drives to 3 separate attorneys. Vivian printed every document, sealing them into fireproof folders, then locking them inside a steel safe bolted beneath the floorboards. Max lay near the window, where moonlight filtered through the thin curtains, casting a silver glow on his dark fur. His eyes didn't close fully, just a soft squint. He appeared to be in a state of anticipation. Outside, the wind stirred. The back door gave a faint creak. Max rose. No barking, no sound, just a silent shift, slow and steady, as Max padded. Onto the porch. Vivian looked up from the paperwork and followed. Max moved carefully, not because he was hurt, but because he was aware. Every step was measured, like a soldier trained to read silence as clearly as noise. The next morning, they were mid-breakfast when the soft chime of an email notification echoed from the living room computer. Lila got up and clicked it open. A short video began to play, sent from an anonymous address. No name, no message, just a single line in the subject field. "This is the missing piece of the story." The video opened on a grainy frame inside a worn-down training room with walls yellowed with age and lighting dim and uneven, but unmistakably the interior of Southridge. The camera slowly panned to a steel cage marked with black stenciled letters, K951. Max. But the Max in the clip looked different. No collar, no name tag. His fur was dirty and matted. His eyes were dull and vacant, but not empty. There was still something left, something flickering, like the last ember in a dying fire. A voice spoke behind the camera. cold. Clinical. Meridian Experiment Phase 3. Emotional dissociation via olfactory disruption. A hand came into view, holding a small vial of amber-colored liquid. The contents were poured onto a piece of cloth, then brought close to Max's muzzle. Max flinched, recoiling in panic. His entire body tensed, trembled. Then suddenly Max growled. For the first time in the entire footage, Max sprang up. He slammed into the steel bars with a jarring crash, snarling, thrashing, as if something precious had just been torn from him. The video shook violently. Someone screamed. And then the final shot. Max, blood dripping from one paw, stood upright in front of the cage door, not broken, not backing down. The footage ended. The screen faded to black. Silence filled the room. Vivian placed a hand gently on David's shoulder. He didn't say a word. His eyes were locked on Max. Lila leaned down, resting her palm against Max's neck, whispering into the thick fur. Max didn't forget anything. No drug could ever make Max forget who he is. Vivian nodded slowly. They thought they could turn Max into something hollow, but Max is a memory. Max is living proof. David clutched the freshly printed documents from the video. This lawsuit, it's not just about Max anymore. This is a case for justice. Max lay at Lila's feet, head slightly lifted. The worry that once clouded his eyes had vanished. What remained was clarity, stillness, resolve. As if finally Max understood that everything he had endured, every scar, every silent cry, had led to this moment. A moment when he would no longer be known as just a dog, but as a soldier. A soldier named Max. Max, not just a dog, but a witness the world tried to silence. In the small kitchen of the hillside home, golden light spilled from the overhead bulb, casting warm shadows across the worn wooden table. Vivian carefully tucked the final sheets of evidence into a manila folder. David stood by the door, phone pressed tightly to his ear, his voice steady and low. We have all the documentation. Max needs witness protection. The sooner, the better. In the middle of the room, Lila sat cross-legged beside Max. Her hand rested gently on his neck like a lifeline. No one said anything else. No one needed to. The way Max breathed slowly, calmly, his eyes quietly watching every movement, every face. It said everything. The next day, an emergency hearing was held at the State District Courthouse. Vivian wore a dark gray coat, documents pressed to her. Chest. David walked beside her, face tight with purpose. Lila followed closely behind, gripping Max's leash not like someone walking a dog, but like a comrade entering a battlefield. Outside the courthouse, reporters and cameras clogged the sidewalk. Lenses zoomed in on Max as if, for the first time, people were realizing a dog could carry a truth too heavy for humans to bear. Is Max a Meridian K9? Is your family suing Southridge? Lila, what did you feel when you saw that footage? Lila didn't answer. Max didn't bark. Together they walked forward through the sea of flashes, silent and upright, like walking through an invisible corridor of honor. Inside the courtroom, the judge looked over the files, then down at Max lying quietly at Lila's feet. No muzzle, no restraints, just Max, steady and still, like a retired soldier who hadn't lost his edge. We are facing a legal precedent, Vivian's attorney began, voice clear and firm. That a dog, a former K9, is not only a living witness, but also a victim of an orchestrated memory erasure operation. He pointed to the video playing on the large screen, the footage of Max ripping through restraints, snarling from the depths of a stolen self. The room held its breath. Some people lowered their heads, but Max's eyes, both on the screen and in that very room, never wavered, bright, sharp, unwavering. Max's memories aren't written in files, the lawyer concluded. But Max is evidence, and if this system once treated him like a tool, then today Max deserves to be heard as a soul. The hearing stretched for more than 2 hours. No ruling yet. But outside the walls of the court, the tides were already turning. That evening, on the front page of the National Animal Welfare Forum, one post raced to the top of trending stories. Its title read, "He bled, he fought, he remembered. Max, the dog who refused to forget. The dog who lost his memories, but never forgot with his heart." That was the headline. Beneath it was a photo of Max lying beside Lila in the courtroom. Not a piece of evidence, not a subject under review, but a soul. One that could love, remember, and endure. That night, Lila lay in bed, the moonlight stretching soft lines across her blanket. Max rested on the floor, close to the bedpost, where her feet could almost touch him if she moved just an inch. The room was quiet, but not empty. Lila leaned over the edge, whispering softly, "Tomorrow might be hard again, but Max, I won't let you go through it alone." Max raised his head. His eyes met hers. No bark, no sound, just that look, steady, warm, and deep, like a silent promise passed between hearts. No matter what comes, Max would be there, not as a canine, not as some retired tool, but as family. Always. Max lay in the middle of the yard, his head resting on Lila's legs, eyes fixed on the old wooden fence where the low hum of approaching trucks echoed softly in the early autumn breeze. One by one, the pickups came to a stop just beyond the gate. The first to step down was an older man, his shoulder uneven from an old injury, carrying a weathered photo frame in one hand. His name was Patrick Sarge Holloway, once the commanding officer of the Eastern K-9 Division, now retired nearly 8 years. Beside him walked Lucia Tan, a former lead trainer from the Nebraska base. 3 others followed. Each had crossed paths with Max at different times in different corners of the country. And today, they'd returned. David opened the gate, saying nothing. A slow nod passed between them, quiet and heavy, like men who'd once shared. A battlefield, and knew they still carried its echoes. "We saw the clip," Sarge said, his voice gravelly, catching slightly in the throat. "We thought we'd hung up the uniform for good, but maybe the war never really ended. Maybe it just changed names." Vivian welcomed them inside. The air in the house felt thick, not tense, but like the kind of silence that comes after a long drought, just before rain. Lucia's eyes trembled as she looked at Max. "I used to say he was too strong, too independent, hard to handle. I was wrong. Max was never meant to be handled. He just needed to be trusted." Max walked up to her, gave a soft sniff to her open palm, then turned and returned to Lila. No command was given. No words were needed. Max knew. Family had come home. David laid the evidence on the table, forged signatures, altered reports, spliced footage. All roads pointed back to the old center, to people they once called colleagues. Now, betrayers. "We have someone still inside," one of the officers said. "They're playing along, keeping quiet, but collecting data." "And now, what do you want?" Vivian asked quietly. Lucia slowly placed a tarnished silver badge on the table. "Not revenge, justice, for Colton, for Max, and for the dogs who were never given names." Outside, the wind picked up. Max lifted his head, ears flicking forward. Not from fear, from instinct. He knew these people weren't here to talk. They were here to finish what had been left undone. Lila stepped out with a pencil sketch in her hands. Max is standing in a field next to a man wearing the insignia of his old unit. No weapons, just peace. "You're Max's family, and if you've ever walked beside him, then you're family to me too," she said softly. No one responded right away. But in that stillness, something changed. It wasn't just a lawsuit anymore. It wasn't a secret buried in old files. It was truth brought into the light by those who had once kept quiet and had now chosen to speak. Later that evening, Dean leaned against the back porch railing, a cigarette half burnt between trembling fingers. The sky above Ridgeway Falls was deepening into indigo, like a heavy cloak wrapped across his chest. Somewhere in the distance, Lila's voice floated up beside Max's low bark, soft and full of the kind of life Dean once thought he couldn't touch. He looked around, like a man searching for a door that had long been closed. Behind him, the screen door creaked open. Vivian stood there, arms crossed, face unreadable. No anger, just that silent kind of disappointment that stings worse than rage. Dean exhaled. The smoke curled up into nothing. "I've done things no one would believe I regret," he muttered hoarsely. "But I do, Vivian. I really do." Vivian didn't answer right away. She walked up beside him, not too close. "Regret isn't something you say out loud. It's whether you've got the courage to look at yourself and not turn away." Dean turned his face aside. He was never good at facing things that didn't shout back. That quiet disappointment in her eyes weighed more than any slap. "I used to think Max was just a dog, just a tool. Same way I thought women should stay in their lane, that kids didn't need dreams." "You got one thing right," Vivian said, her voice calm and steady. "You used to think." A long while later, Dean reached into his coat and pulled out an old photo creased at the corners, yellowed by time. It was Lila as a child, sitting on the porch with Max curled up beside her. Their faces glowed with a joy so pure, untouched by the cracks and weight of the adult world. "I missed too much," Dean said quietly. "Lost too much. I know I don't deserve it. But if there's any chance, even a small one, to fix just a piece of it, I'll take it." Vivian looked at him. She didn't nod. She didn't say no either. Instead, she reached out, took the photo from his hand, and slipped it into her own pocket. "Tomorrow, we're submitting the covert footage to the court, but they'll need verification from someone who worked on the inside with Hammond and that team." Dean's eyes widened. "You mean, I don't trust you," Vivian said, her voice calm but steady. "But Max has never been wrong about people." She paused, then continued. "That day, Max didn't attack you. He just stood between us, like he was reminding me that sometimes the ones who lost their way still need someone to put the signpost back in place." The silence between them stretched, thick and still. Dean gave a slow nod. No more excuses. No more liquor. Just one path left: stand with the truth or stay a shadow of his own mistakes. That night, after everyone had gone upstairs, Dean sat quietly on the back porch. Max lay beside him. There were no pats. Max didn't look at him, but the warmth at his side was enough for Dean to realize something he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't cold anymore. Inside the shadow of the porch, Vivian stood holding a light blanket in her arms. She didn't step out right away. She just stood there, watching the man who had once kept her up at night with fear, and Max, now still as stone beside him, no longer needing to growl. She drew in a deep breath, and finally walked forward. She laid the blanket on the wooden railing, close but not intrusive. Dean looked up. Said nothing. Vivian sat down a few steps away, not close enough for comfort, but not distant enough to mean nothing. "There was a time I wished you'd disappear forever," she began, eyes fixed on the flickering fence light in the distance. "Some nights I held Lila in the dark and prayed that by morning they'd take you away for something. Anything." Dean gave a slight nod. No defense, no story. Just the weight of truth. Vivian continued, her voice steady but heavy with fatigue. "But then I realized If I kept wishing you'd pay for everything, I'd be the one staying trapped in all that anger. Lila needs a mother who knows when to let go, not a woman who keeps carrying weight that was never hers to hold forever." Dean let out a long breath. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness." "And I'm not offering it," Vivian said, turning to look at him. "At least, not yet. But I'll say this, you're trying. And maybe Max sees that too." At that moment, Max shifted a little, his head still resting on his front paws. No growling. Just that softened gaze, the kind that comes from someone who's been through storms and now watches the world with patience instead of fear. Dean looked at Max, then back at Vivian. "I used to say Max was just a dog, just a tool, but now I think that's where I got it all wrong. Max was never just a dog. Max is what's left of Colton, the part of him I never could understand but always should have." Vivian went still. That name, Colton, swept through her like a sudden chill. It tugged at something buried deep enough to make her eyes sting. "I still have Colton's old jacket," she whispered. "Max knows the scent. Every time Lila puts it on, Max follows her step for step, like he's still on duty, guarding someone who isn't coming back." Dean swallowed hard, his head lowering, shoulders trembling just enough to betray the emotion he was trying to hold in. Vivian stood up. She picked up the blanket and gently laid it across Dean's lap. "You're cold, and Max won't stay pressed up to you forever." Dean looked up. His eyes were glassy, but no tears fell. "Thank you," he murmured. Vivian nodded. "Just stay out here. We've got a full day tomorrow." Then she turned and walked inside, leaving Dean and Max beneath the night sky of Ridgway Falls. The moon hung low, not bright, not full, but enough. Enough to reveal something simple and human, that some wounds don't need to be healed overnight. Sometimes it's enough just to know there's still a way back. The next morning, Ridgway Falls woke under a blanket of thick fog. But Town Hall was wide awake. Outside, reporters crowded around barricades, cameras stacked shoulder to shoulder. A sea of people lined the sidewalk, holding handmade signs that read, "Max is not evidence, he's a witness, and we believe Max, we believe Colton." Inside the courtroom, not a single seat remained empty. The front row was filled with former officers who had once served alongside Colton. No one wore a uniform, but every man and woman sat upright, eyes locked on the defense table where the representatives from Southridge and James Hammond sat, silent and still under the weight of what was coming. At the center of the courtroom, in the witness box where humans usually sat, lay Max. No collar, no muzzle, just a soft leather tag resting across his shoulder that read, "K9 Tactical Unit, Honorably Discharged, Max." Max stayed still, eyes open, ears perked just enough. It was as if he could feel the air stretched thin with tension, every molecule in the room vibrating like a string pulled too tight. Vivian sat beside him, holding a thick folder against her chest. On her other side was David, steady and focused, and right next to him was Lila. No dress, no outfit made to impress, just an old hoodie, faded jeans, and her hand resting gently against Max's back, unmoving. When the judge's gavel dropped, silence fell like a stone. The voice over the speakers cracked through the stillness. "We now begin the hearing on allegations of memory tampering and biomedical ethics violations involving a retired military K9 subject named Max, Tactical ID MX-0891. From the defense table, James Hammond sat with his lawyer, his expression a mask of calm, but his knuckles, bone-white and trembling, betrayed him. Vivian was the first to rise. She wasn't a lawyer. She had never stood in a courtroom as a plaintiff before. But when she stepped forward and slid a USB drive into the courtroom display, no one looked away. The screen flickered to life. The video was shaky. Diamond Soy's grainy. "This," Vivian said, her voice firm and steady, "is what they did when they thought no one was watching." The screen lit up with footage of Max tied down by steel cable inside a training room. 3 men in white coats stood nearby, speaking over a tray of dark chemical vials. James Hammond pointed at a thick amber bottle and barked, "Stronger. This one's special. We have to make sure it doesn't react to any scent trace linked to Meridian." A low gasp swept through the courtroom, then vanished into silence. The retired officers in the front row sat up straighter. Not surprised, just quietly, painfully affirmed. Their faces said it all. They had suspected, but they had never been able to prove it. In the video, Max thrashed, growling, until he tore through the restraints. A vial shattered on the ground. The footage froze just as James whipped around, yelling into the ceiling camera, "Shut down the system! None of this gets recorded!" The courtroom didn't move. The judge lowered his head, flipping through the transcript. Jurors scribbled notes. Defense attorneys leaned into hurried whispers. One stood up and objected loudly. "This footage is inadmissible, illegally obtained and unverifiable." David rose slowly, his voice calm but resonant enough to silence the room. "We have the technician's logs confirming the backup, and here is the signed affidavit from the Data Extraction Unit, officially validating this file as originating from Southridge's archived system." His hand trembled slightly as he held up the document, not from nerves, but from the weight of everything it represented. Years of silence, loss, and now a chance at truth. Max didn't move, didn't growl, but his ears stayed alert, because even without words, Max knew. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about every dog who never made it to this room, and every soldier who died believing no one would ever know what really happened. He tossed a thick folder onto the defendant's table. The sound of paper hitting wood cracked through the courtroom like a strike of thunder. The judge gave a small nod. "Accepted as preliminary evidence." In the corner of the room, Max remained still, but his tail moved ever so slightly. A quiet flick, as if he understood. Something was shifting. Lila leaned in close, whispering near Max's ear, "You don't need to say anything. The truth already has." Max didn't growl, didn't bark. He just exhaled gently and lifted his head. His eyes rose to the witness stand and locked onto James Hammond. No sound, no movement, just that look. And in that single quiet moment, it was as if Max had spoken the names of every buried secret, not with words, but with a silence louder than any accusation. James Hammond looked away. Then, without warning, Lila stepped forward. No one had called her. Her name wasn't on the witness list. But something about the firmness in her step made the judge raise a hand toward the guards, signaling them to let her pass. "I'd like to say something," Lila spoke up. Her voice was young, but steady. Not angry, not fragile, just honest. And that made everyone listen. The judge nodded. "Who are you?" "My name is Lila Monroe. I'm the daughter of Colton Monroe, and I'm the one who's been living with Max." A hum swept through the room like a current. Reporters flipped through notebooks. James's jaw clenched tight. Lila stepped up to the stand. Max didn't move. He remained where he was, seated below, like a silent sentinel guarding the moment. "I know I'm not an expert," Lila began, eyes steady, "but I don't need to be one to understand this. Max isn't a tool. Max is family, and he's the last piece I have left of my father." She paused, just for a breath, then continued, softer, but stronger. "They say Max can't testify because he doesn't speak. But I want to ask everyone here, when that dog was injected, tied up, and had his memories erased, how did he still know how to stay beside me through the nights I couldn't sleep? How did he know when to bark if a stranger came too close? How did he know to stand between my mom and the man who once hit her? The room held its breath. Lila's voice didn't shake. It rose gently, full of something more powerful than anger. It's because Max remembers, not with his brain, but with his heart. An older officer stood up. His hair was silver, and his hands had trembled earlier when the video of Max's torture played. Now his voice was steady. The girl is right. Then another voice followed. A woman in a faded blue shirt, her unit badge almost worn away. I served with Colton. I confirmed that Max saved 3 soldiers during the Meridian incident. If it hadn't been for Max, my son wouldn't be alive today. One by one, people stood. A whole row rose to their feet. No one asked them to. They just did. Their eyes fixed forward, not on the judge, not on James Hammond, but on Max, lying there, motionless except for his slow breath. Eyes clear, aware, shining. Vivian clutched David's hand tightly. No words were needed. They both knew it. This was the turning point. The judge looked out over the courtroom. Before us stands a witness who cannot speak, but it's clear there are too many voices here, speaking for Max. James Hammond suddenly jumped to his feet. This is a circus. A dog can't possibly— Shut your mouth! A voice cut through the air like a blade. It was Dean. From the back of the courtroom, he stepped forward. Max doesn't need to know the law. Max just needs to remember who ordered the injection, who erased the memory, and who got Colton killed. Dean walked slowly toward the front. His hand shook slightly, but his eyes never wavered. And you know damn well, Hammond, Max never forgot. James stepped back. His words dried up. For the first time, he had nothing to say. The judge nodded, turning to Hammond's attorney. The court will consider the video footage, the testimonies of former officers, and the statement made by Miss Lila Monroe to be entered into the official record. A moment later, the gavel struck. Court is adjourned until tomorrow morning. Purpose: further evidence gathering, including internal documents from Southridge proposed for declassification. Max didn't bark. He didn't move. He simply lowered his head onto Lila's feet, quietly, gently, just as he had done during the nights she cried alone. Outside the courtroom, the press waited. Microphones, cameras, questions, but no one spoke yet. Instead, a new sign was raised above the crowd. Max, the dog who couldn't speak, but spoke for hundreds. Lila stood just behind the courtroom glass. Her small hand gripped the leash tightly. Max lay curled at her feet, his head resting softly over her foot. Warm, steady. There was nothing more that needed to be said. The court was in recess for 15 minutes, but outside, the courthouse steps were already filled. Hundreds stood shoulder to shoulder. Some wore old uniforms, their badges dulled by time. Others held framed photos of dogs who had died on missions that never made headlines. And in between them stood children like Lila, clutching stuffed German shepherds in their arms. Their eyes were red, but their backs were straight like little warriors. A woman approached David quietly, her eyes brimming with tears. My son was saved by Max during a fire. I'm here today, to repay that debt. David didn't speak. He only gave her a small nod. For the first time in years, the pain of losing Colton no longer felt meaningless. Inside, as the hearing resumed, the judge looked over the files stacked thicker with each day of testimony. Then he turned toward James Hammond, whose face had gone pale. Sweat glistened at his temples. Mr. Hammond, the judge said, voice calm but sharp. This court has reviewed all video evidence, including deleted internal footage, indirect admissions made by you, and a hidden camera recording provided by an anonymous source. A pause. Do you have anything to add before I announce a preliminary ruling? James swallowed hard, but he didn't stand. He knew, no matter what he said now, no one in that room would believe him. Lila looked down at Max. Max hadn't moved, still lying there, yet every rise and fall of his breath felt like it echoed across the room. The judge continued. Max, K9 number 14. Southridge is not simply a piece of evidence. Max is a living witness. Words are not needed. Documents are not needed. His biological responses, behavioral patterns, and sequence of reactions exposed truths the system had buried. From the back of the courtroom, a journalist raised their camera. The broadcast went live. Lights from the news crews swept across the courtroom, but what filled the room wasn't just light. It was something heavier, something deeper. The moment when emotion became undeniable. Lila stepped forward again. She looked directly at the bench. "I don't want anyone to go to prison," she began, voice soft but certain. "But I want everyone to understand this. Max is not broken. He is not damaged goods. He is not a failed project." Her voice wavered. "Max is justice. The justice my dad left behind. And if anyone thinks they can erase a memory with a single injection, then that person has never truly lived." The courtroom fell silent. Then, from the back, a single clap rang out. Then another. Then a third. And before long, the entire courtroom rose to their feet, the sound of applause building into something that wasn't just support, it was truth, recognition, honor, and the long-overdue sound of a dog's memory being believed. No cheers, no chaos, just the sound of applause, steady, respectful, and full of reverence for Max. Max lifted his head. His eyes met Vivian's, then David's, then Dean's. Finally, they rested on Lila, and then Max stood up. Slowly. One step at a time, he walked to the center of the courtroom, where a shaft of light beamed down from the skylight above, cutting through the dust and falling on the old wooden floor. Max didn't bark. He didn't need to. He simply lifted his head, as if saluting. The entire nation watched that moment on live broadcast, and in millions of homes and hearts, people knew some truths don't need to be shouted, they just need to be seen. That night, headlines swept across every major outlet. Max, the dog who stood at the crossroads of justice and humanity. A silent verdict, when justice doesn't speak, but the world still listens. And up in the night sky over Ridgeway Falls, a meteor streaked across the heavens like a quiet stroke of time. Lila whispered to Max, whose head rested gently on her legs, his tail flicking once, as if he understood her every word. "We won, Max. And this time, it's real." Ridgeway Falls slumbered beneath that star-streaked sky, holding its breath for what was meant to come next. But at dawn, as the first light spilled across the town square outside the state courthouse, something had changed. The press had already gathered, elbow to elbow. Barricades lined the steps, and at the very center of the stone staircase leading to the hearing chamber stood a hastily printed sign. "State hearing canceled, security reasons." Vivian stepped out of the car first, eyes squinting at the sign in disbelief. David followed closely behind. Max stayed by their side, calm and steady, his steps deliberate. No one spoke. But from every direction they came former soldiers, ex-staff, whistleblowers, and survivors all quietly stepping into line. A reporter pushed toward the railing. "Mrs. Monroe, is it true the hearing was canceled after Hammond withdrew his countersuit?" Vivian didn't answer right away. Her eyes swept the crowd, not out of fear, but to be sure this wasn't a hidden battle anymore. Lila gripped her mother's hand tightly. Max lifted his head, eyes sharp as a blade drawn under moonlight. And then, from down the street, came the sound of a siren. An old pickup rumbled slowly into the square. Its bed was stacked with sealed file crates, each stamped in bold red. Meridian, Surveillance Archive, Classified. The man who stepped out of the driver's seat was Carl Redden, the technician who once wept for Max. He wasn't wearing a lab coat, just an old flannel shirt, a frayed cap, and in his arms, a portable hard drive clutched like something sacred. "I brought everything," Carl said, his voice tight with emotion. "The records, the logs, the footage, the test reports. I kept it all because of one dog who couldn't speak, but never betrayed the trust we put in him." Silence swept across the courthouse steps. Then came the applause. Not thunderous, not wild, but firm and rising. From people who had once turned away, who had once been afraid. Vivian climbed several steps, her voice cutting through the cool morning air like a bell. "The hearing may be cancelled, but the truth is not. They can tear up calendars and turn off courtroom lights, but they cannot silence an entire town. They cannot erase what Max remembers, and they cannot stop what's coming." Max stood by her side. The wind rustled the fur around his neck, lifting it just enough to shimmer in the sunlight. A dog, a soldier. Standing in the square like a monument to the silence that had finally been broken. Lila leaned down and whispered, just loud enough for Max to hear. "You don't need the court anymore, Max. The whole world already knows." Max didn't bark, didn't growl. He stepped forward slowly and touched his nose gently to Carl's hand. A silent thank you. Behind them, a banner rose into the air. "Max, the dog who couldn't speak but spoke for hundreds." The hearing had been cancelled, but history was just rewritten in the center of Ridgway Falls. And then, on the afternoon of the third day, while reporters still camped outside the courthouse lawn, a weathered military SUV pulled to a stop at the gate. No one stepped out immediately, but when the door finally opened, the town held its breath. The first man was Trent Caldwell, former chief technician with Meridian's Rapid Response Unit. Behind him came Elijah Torres, a toxicology specialist. Then Samantha Greer, once a field coordinator. And last, moving slower than the rest, was Daniel Nungo, a recon scout who'd lost half a hand during a failed chemical exercise years ago. 4 soldiers, once forgotten, now standing before the very system that had once ignored them. And this time, they carried more than stories. They carried proof. David and Vivian hurried forward. Lila stayed back, gripping Max's harness. Both of them watched in silence. Trent gave David a single nod, then unzipped his pack and pulled out a small wooden case. Inside was a sealed hard drive and a signed authentication document from the Military Archive Bureau. "Colton backed up everything related to the Meridian investigation on this drive," Trent said, his eyes locked on Max. "He told me, if anything ever happened, Max would be the only one who could lead us to the truth." Samantha gently picked up an old photo tucked between the documents. It showed Colton and Max on their first day of duty. Max sat tall, ears perked, while Colton stood beside him with one hand resting protectively on Max's back. "Colton wasn't the easiest guy to warm up to," she said with a soft chuckle. "But I've never seen a K9 make a soldier feel protected the way Max did for him." Vivian clenched her hands, her eyes glassy with tears. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Why now? After all this time?" Elijah Torres looked toward the crowd of cameras and reporters still lingering on the outskirts of the courthouse. "Because now, Max isn't a target anymore," he said. "Max is the reason we came back." Inside the building, the district attorney's office had already begun the early stages of reopening the case. Within 48 hours, representatives from the military's Internal Affairs Unit were scheduled to arrive in Ridgway Falls. The new evidence, including the videos, classified reports, and sworn statements from the 4 soldiers, was deemed admissible and actionable. That evening, after the noise had quieted and most of the crowd had gone home, Max was led onto the back porch of the house. No applause, no flashing lights, just a soft silence that settled like a warm blanket. Samantha walked over and slowly lowered herself beside Max. "It's been a long time," she whispered, placing a gentle hand on his back. "You still remember, don't you?" Max didn't growl, didn't bark. He simply lowered his head and rested his chin on Samantha's knee. A quiet hello. A memory returned. Daniel Ngo, who had barely spoken all afternoon, suddenly stepped forward from the shadows. "I once told myself I'd never come back here," he said. "But if a dog can survive just to protect the memory of his best friend, then the least we can do is live to protect him." Lila came closer, her hand finding David's. "He didn't just survive to protect Dad," she whispered. "He lived so we'd understand what it really means to do the right thing, even when it costs something." That night, for the first time in many years, Ridgway Falls didn't lie awake in fear. There was only a quiet waiting, for justice, for healing, and for a dog who now lay in the doorway of a home, knowing that for the first time in a long time, Max wasn't fighting alone anymore. Trent gave David a steady nod, then unzipped his weathered pack and pulled out a small wooden box. He opened it with care. Inside was a sealed hard drive, labeled and accompanied by an official verification slip from the military archive unit. "Colton backed up everything about the Meridian operation onto this drive," Trent said, his eyes locking onto Max. "He once told me, if anything ever happened, only Max would know how to guide us to the right ending." Samantha reached over and picked up an old photograph, its edges curled with time. It showed Colton standing beside Max on their first day as partners. The soldier's stance was stiff, uncertain. Max, though, looked calm. Ready. Colton wasn't exactly the warm and fuzzy type. Samantha smiled softly. "But I've never seen a K9 make a soldier feel safer than Max made Colton feel." Vivian's fingers tightened around her sleeve, her eyes brimming. "Why now? Why come back now?" Elijah Torres turned his gaze toward the cameras still rolling from a distance. "Because Max isn't the target anymore. Max is the reason we came back." Inside the courthouse, the prosecution began filing for a full case reopening. Within 48 hours, the Military Internal Affairs Bureau would send a special unit to Ridgway Falls. Dozens of new exhibits, video clips, forensic reports, and testimonies from the 4 soldiers were marked as valid evidence and cleared for indictment proceedings. That night, long after most of the crowd had left and the streets were still again, Max was let out onto the porch. No cheers, no lights, just a quiet breeze slipping through the trees as Samantha stepped closer, sitting gently beside him. "It's been a long time," she whispered, resting her palm on Max's back. "You still remember, don't you?" Max didn't growl, didn't bark. He simply lowered his head and rested his chin on Samantha's leg. A hello, or maybe a memory finding its place. Daniel Ngo, who had stayed silent through most of the day, suddenly broke the silence. "I used to think I'd never return here," he said. "But if a dog can survive to protect the memory of his best friend, then the least we can do is live to protect him." Lila stepped forward and slipped her hand into David's. Her voice was soft but sure. "He didn't just live to protect Dad," she said. "He lived so we'd all understand what's right, even when it costs everything." And that night, for the first time in many years, Ridgway Falls didn't stay up fearing what might come. There was only the quiet waiting. For justice. For truth. And for a dog curled on a warm porch under a quiet sky who finally knew. This time Max wouldn't have to fight alone. The next morning, just as the mist was lifting off the fields, a sand-colored SUV pulled into the Monroe driveway. The doors opened slowly. 4 people stepped out, 3 men and 1 woman, all in old tactical jackets, their sleeves dusted from the road. But their steps were steady, like they had never truly left formation. David was the first to recognize them. "Royce, and the others?" "Delta 4, said the biggest man, his voice solid as stone. "The last special ops team to run beside Colton, and beside Max." Vivian stepped out and nodded once. There was no need for introductions. Every crease on their faces, every quiet nod said enough. They weren't here for a visit. They were here to finish something that had been left undone for far too long. Royce laid a waterproof tactical bag on the kitchen table and unzipped it. Inside was a shock-proof hard drive, double-sealed with lead lining and dense foam. Alongside it, military-labeled document pouches, still sealed. "We've kept this since the day Colton died," Royce said, his voice low and steady. "It couldn't go online. It couldn't risk interception. Only Max knows how to follow the scent. And we, those who heard Colton's last words, he told us, if I don't make it back, find Max." David stood frozen. His hand closed tightly around the bag's strap, as if gripping his son's final wish. Lila sat cross-legged on the floor. Max was beside her, his head resting gently across her legs. Max didn't bark, didn't growl. He just watched, waiting. Royce bent down and whispered, "I owe you a life. And I'm paying it, with the truth." They plugged in the hard drive. The screen lit up with grainy footage time-stamped from 5 years ago. A remote training facility. Colton was testing Max against an unmarked chemical compound. The audio was choppy, but one line cut through clearly as Colton shouted, "Max is locked on! This is it! This is what killed the kids at Meridian!" Then came a voice recording. Colton's voice was urgent. "I'm being followed. Might be someone inside the center. If I disappear, find Royce. Max is the living proof. Don't let them get to him." The screen jumped. Cut. Next, footage of 3 men in white lab coats sneaking a chemical container into the restricted wing. Among them, unmistakably, was Troy Haskins. "That was the last time we saw him," Royce said. 2 weeks before Colton died, he resigned and wiped his record, but the external backup cam still caught this. Vivian turned away. Not because she was weak, but because fury had no place in what came next. She understood now. They wouldn't need fists. They wouldn't need shouting. The truth would walk through the doors on its own. Royce set another thick envelope on the table, sealed with a military wax stamp. "We also tracked down a chemical compliance officer from the center. He's agreed to testify." David nodded silently. Max stretched, shifting his weight, but stayed close to the door, his head raised, his ears angled forward, like he knew the ones who had left were finally home. And this time, no one came back empty-handed. As the sunset draped over the rooftops of Ridgeway, Max remained still. His eyes were wide open, not in alertness, but in quiet calm. It was as if Max understood, in a way only he could, that the ones who had once stayed silent had now chosen to stand beside him. And this time, Max wasn't alone. At exactly 7:03 the next morning, the gates of Southridge opened. There were no sirens, no armed escorts, just a single old pickup truck waiting quietly at the curb. Lila sat in the back seat, her eyes locked on the gate. Vivian held her daughter's hand. David gripped the steering wheel with fingers that had trembled more than once through the night. A middle-aged officer emerged first. Behind him were 2 men in black suits, representatives from the Federal Investigations Committee. But no one spoke, because between them walked a figure, steady and slow. Maximum. Still Max. His fur had been shaved for toxicology tests. Scars lined his shoulder from a chemical injection that nearly took his life, and yet in his eyes there was no fear. Just that same unwavering calm from long ago. Lila flung open the car door before David had even fully braked. She dropped to her knees in the street, arms wide. Max didn't need a command. He ran to her as if nothing had ever separated them, not because of training, but because that's where he belonged. Because that was home. An hour later, the name Troy Haskins flashed across every morning news channel, suspended from duty, under federal investigation for signature ties to the use of the K9 inert protocol, an outlawed compound found in the syringe meant for Max. Outside Southridge headquarters, the press formed a wall of cameras and microphones. A spokeswoman read a statement with trembling hands, but no one really needed her words anymore. The video had already gone viral with footage from Vivian's home security system. It showed a man in medical scrubs sneaking toward Max. It showed David discovering the syringe. It showed Max growling a warning. And now, it showed Max coming home, alive. That afternoon, in the Monroe family's backyard, Dean set out 2 wooden chairs facing each other with a water bowl placed gently between them. Max laid at Lila's feet, his head lifted, watching everyone with the quiet presence of a guardian. Dean handed Vivian a thin folder. "It's Colton's," he said softly. "I kept it, thinking one day I'd use it for revenge, but now I think maybe it's time we used it to finish things. To finish them, not in anger, not in pain, but with truth, and with love." Vivian didn't open the folder right away. She just looked at Max, then at Lila. "Max has done his part," she whispered. "Now it's our turn." That night, the lights inside the house stayed on. Not because of fear, but because, for the first time in years, everyone wanted to truly see one another. David flipped on the television. A local news channel was airing a breaking report. Troy Haskins is now under federal investigation for 4 criminal charges, including abuse of authority, illegal use of restricted substances on service animals, and obstruction of federal inquiry. Lila turned toward Max. "Did you hear that? They called you a service animal." She smiled. "But to me, you're family." Max didn't respond. Just let out a soft breath, then nudged closer and rested his head gently across her legs. Quiet, steady, as if nothing had ever changed. Across the state, inside an interrogation room, Troy Haskins sat across from 2 federal agents. On the table before him lay printed video stills, a thick file of pharmaceutical trace reports, and, most unexpected of all, a faded photograph. It was Colton Monroe, standing beside Max. Both are facing the camera. Colton's eyes were steady and determined. Max's eyes, as if guarding the world. One agent leaned in. "You thought a dog couldn't testify?" The other agent gave a slight smile. "Maybe not, but a whole town can." Troy said nothing, because for the first time, he understood. The battle he thought he had silenced was where the truth had only just begun to rise. By 10 p.m., Max was still lying on the porch, no longer guarding, no longer waiting. Max simply wanted to stay there beneath the gentle rustle of wind, among the quiet footsteps of peace, as if, at last, he had found what he'd been trying to hold on to all these years. Trust. A place to belong. And this time, it was forever. Soft evening light streamed across the wooden porch of the old house. Thin rays filtered through the canopy of red maple leaves, casting a warm amber hue on the floorboards below. In that quiet pocket of the world, Max lay still, his head resting gently on Lila's leg, eyes half closed like in sleep, ears twitching lightly to familiar porch sounds. Vivian stepped out first, 2 steaming cups of tea in hand. One she passed to David. The other. She sat down beside Max. Not because Max needed a drink, but because Max had always been part of these quiet evenings. And in their home, offering Max a cup of tea was their way of saying what they already knew deep down. Max wasn't a dog, Max was home. Avid slid his rocking chair a little closer. He didn't say anything, just reached out, slowly brushing his hand along Max's back. The thick, warm fur covered scars that time hadn't erased and no longer needed to. Because now, they weren't marks of pain, They were proof of everything Max had survived. The back door creaked open. Dean stepped out, holding a stack of old books. He sat down on the lowest porch step, gave a small nod to Vivian, then looked at Max for a long, quiet moment. Without a word, Max stood, walked over, and gently pressed his nose to Dean's knee. No tail wag, just one soft touch. Light, quick, but enough to make Dean's eyes mist over. "Thank you, Max," he whispered, his voice trembling like someone who'd just survived a battlefield no one else could see. "For coming back, for not giving up." Lila ran out from inside, carrying a large cream-colored towel. She spread it out beside Max, sat down next to him, and leaned her head against his shoulder. "This is how Max likes to lie best," Lila said softly, gazing out toward the trees in the distance. "Here, with everyone. No shouting, no needles, no one telling him to forget." Vivian placed a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder, bending down beside her. "Max remembers," she said, "but he's not afraid, because now he knows he's safe." The wind carried the scent of pine, damp soil, and something else, something tender and familiar, like the worn jacket of Colton still hanging in the back closet, or the footfalls of people once lost, who had finally returned. Max didn't sleep. Max simply closed his eyes and listened. A sparrow landed on the fence post, chirping softly, as if even the birds could sense it. Peace had finally returned to this place. No sirens, no shouting, just calm breaths. The slow, steady heartbeat of a dog who had fought long and hard, suffered deeply, and now could rest. Not because he'd given up, but because he'd made it home. As the sun lowered beneath the horizon, Max gently shifted his head, resting it over Lila's feet. Not to ask for protection, but to offer it. From this day forward, Max would be the protector, just as he always was, and just as he always would be. 1 week later, the old red brick Ridgeway Community Center reopened. There were no more protest banners, no more angry horns, just quiet applause, hopeful glances, and a new wooden sign hung proudly above the gate. "Max Therapy Dog, welcome home." David pushed open the therapy room door and let Lila walk in first. In her arms was a thin cloth embroidered with a paw print in one corner. Following close behind was Max, moving slowly and steadily, ears high and head level. No longer a K-9 trained for pursuit through brutal drills and fire zones. Now, Max was a warrior stepping into a new battleground with no gunfire and no enemies. But so many still needed healing. Their first patient was an elderly veteran who had lost his left leg in an explosion near the southern border. He sat motionless on a wooden chair, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the floor. Until Max walked forward. No growl, no bark, just a calm step until he reached the old man, sat down in front of him, and gently rested his head on the man's knee, as if waiting for a familiar pat on the head. The man looked up. Slowly. So slowly. And then, with a hand that trembled from years of silence, he placed it on Max's head and let it stay there, unmoving. A young therapist standing nearby whispered, "It's been 2 years since he's let anyone touch him." Vivian stood behind the observation window, her eyes glassy. Her hand gently squeezed Lila's shoulder, and Lila simply nodded because there are some things you don't need words for. Just seeing Max sitting there was enough. From that day forward, Max had a schedule of his own. Mornings were spent with children suffering from PTSD. Afternoons were for veterans. Some days, Max did nothing but lie there so someone could hold him. Other days, Max would walk over to a crying child and press his muzzle gently against their hand. And some nights, Max just sat beside the empty chair on the porch of the center, like he was waiting for someone who hadn't yet found the courage to walk through the door. Max didn't perform miracles. He simply showed up. But his presence, his steady, loyal, silent presence, was the miracle. As if Max was saying with every breath, "I've been there. I know what it's like to be left behind, but I also know we can keep going." Once, an 8-year-old boy who had watched his father die in a car accident stared at Max for a long time before whispering, "Do you think Max gets sad when grown-ups treat him badly?" Max just lifted his head, looked into the boy's eyes, then walked over and placed his chin gently on the boy's knee. No answer needed. And from that day forward, that little boy stopped hiding under the table during therapy sessions. One quiet weekend evening as the center. Prepared to close, Vivian sat with the head of the therapy department. He placed a folder on the table. A formal recognition. Max, the first retired K-9 ever recalled due to medical trauma, was now officially a state-certified therapy dog and an emblem of emotional recovery. Vivian didn't sign right away. She turned to look out at the porch where Max was lying, the wind gently ruffling the fur around his neck. Max wasn't asleep. Max was still keeping watch, just like always, but this time, not guarding against threats. This time Max was standing watch over broken hearts, slowly being stitched back together by the warmth of 4 quiet paws. Later that month, the center held a special day. Family Day for those who've lost a K-9. It wasn't a large crowd, but every step through the front door, every glance cast towards the memorial wall, carried something that didn't need to be named. An elderly woman with snow-white hair brought an old leather collar and a faded photo of her German shepherd from the war. A young boy, no more than 10, clutched a jacket that once belonged to the father he'd never see again. And a retired soldier, limping and silent, simply stood still, watching Max. Max didn't need an introduction. Max simply moved through the crowd, slow, steady, like each paw step was gently gathering fragments of memory time had left behind. That afternoon, as the visitors slowly trickled away, Lila made her way to the wooden memorial board where pictures of fallen K-9s were pinned. She reached up and gently added a new photo, not of a dog who had passed, but of Max sitting beside her in the apple orchard behind their house. A woman leaned in and whispered, "Who's that little girl?" Vivian, standing nearby, smiled softly. "She's the one who helped Max become himself again." That night, Lila didn't sleep in her room. She spread a blanket out on the porch. Max lay beside her. The air was still. Only the distant chirping of crickets drifted in from the fields. Yet Max lifted his head, ears alert, listening, as if for something older than time. Lila whispered, "Max, do you ever wonder why you were born?" Max didn't answer. He didn't need to. He turned his body and rested his head against the girl's chest. His heartbeat was steady, strong, warm. "I think," Lila smiled, "you were born to find what others lost." 1 week later, during the final staff meeting at the center, the head therapist stood up and made a simple announcement. "We don't just have a dog who listens, we have a comrade who remembers." He then turned to Max and bowed, a gesture of solemn respect. "Thank you, Max, not because you were once K-9, but because you taught us that memory doesn't live in the mind, it lives in the heart." The entire room rose. No applause, no fanfare, just a silence filled with reverence and deep gratitude. Years later, they would still tell the story of a dog named Max in Ridgeway. Not the strongest, not the fastest, not the most fearsome. But Max had something no handler could ever train. Max always found what was lost: a collar buried beneath the rubble, a child without her mother, a man who had forgotten how to trust. And even the memories, people thought they had long left behind. That afternoon, Lila sat sketching on the porch. Max lay beside her, his head resting gently on her leg. On the page, a dirt road stretching into the horizon. Two figures walking side by side. A little girl and a gray-furred dog, moving toward the sunset, together. In the bottom corner of the drawing, Lila wrote, "No one is hopeless if Max is by their side.